Vernon Strake didn't even look up from his ledger when he ordered Gideon Rourke's life destroyed. That was the part that stayed with Gideon longest, not the threats, not the cold, not the moment his children asked where they were going to sleep. It was the casual way Strake flipped a page and said to his foreman, "Make sure he understands what happens to men who embarrass me," as though Gideon were a fence post that needed removing. By noon the next day, every door in Redwater Crossing had closed. By the following morning, Gideon's children were shivering in a wagon, driving into a Montana snowstorm with nowhere left to go. If you've ever watched someone powerful destroy an honest man, simply because he refused to look the other way, you already know this feeling. And if you've ever been that honest man, you know there are no words for it. This is that story. Before we go further, if you're new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The cattle yard at Redwater Crossing smelled the way all cattle yards smelled, like dirt and manure and money-changing hands, and on that particular Tuesday morning in November, Gideon Rourke had exactly $4.60 in his coat pocket and enough pride left to make that a dangerous combination. He wasn't looking for trouble. That was the thing people never quite believed afterward, because the way events unfolded made it seem like Gideon had walked into that yard with a plan. He hadn't. He'd walked in looking for work. He'd heard the Clements operation was taking on 2 extra hands for the week's loading, and $4.60 didn't stretch far when you had 2 children to feed, and a landlord who charged first and smiled second. Caleb was 12. Maisie was 8. Their mother, Helen, had been gone 14 months, taken by a fever that moved faster than any doctor in the territory could catch up to. Gideon didn't talk about Helen much anymore, not because he'd stopped missing her, but because grief had a way of making people around you uncomfortable, and he needed those people to hire him. He'd gotten to the cattle yard early enough to watch the weighing process from the side fence before the foreman found him something useful to do. That was habit with Gideon: observe first, then work. Understand the operation before you insert yourself into it. It had made him a reliable hand on 4 different ranches over 8 years, the kind of man foremen asked back, because he didn't require constant supervision and didn't create problems. That morning, the problems were already there. He just happened to see them. Vernon Strake was standing at the weighing platform beside old Abel Mercer, and what Gideon noticed first wasn't anything dramatic. It was small. The kind of small that only registered if you'd spent years watching how cattle weight recorded, how the scale needle moved, how a man's pen moved in relation to that needle. Strake's pen moved before the needle stopped. Not once. 3 times in 20 minutes. Each time, Abel Mercer watched the scale with the patient exhaustion of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and trusted that the system worked because it had always worked. Because men like Strake ran operations that were too large and too established to bother with cheating an old rancher over a few pounds per head. Abel had driven 63 cattle to that yard. 63 head represented most of his winter income. He stood with his hat in his hands and waited for the number. And when Strake wrote it down and named the price, Abel nodded the way men nod when they don't understand arithmetic well enough to argue. Gideon understood arithmetic well enough. He wasn't entirely certain at first. He told himself that later, many times, because it mattered to him that he hadn't acted on impulse. He watched one more weighing, a second rancher's cattle, and he watched Strake's pen, and he did the numbers in his head the way his father had taught him to do numbers, quick and quiet and certain. The discrepancy on Abel Mercer's cattle was somewhere between 12 and 18%. 12 to 18% on 63 head of cattle, at Strake's quoted price, was the difference between Abel Mercer making it through winter or not. Gideon stayed by the fence for a moment longer. He watched Abel fold the payment receipt carefully, the way people fold documents they intend to keep safe, and he watched the old man start toward the yard gate with the satisfied enough expression of someone who had done what needed doing and was ready to go home. He thought about his $4.60. He thought about the job he'd come here to get. He thought about Caleb and Maisie back at the boarding house. Maisie with that cough that had been worsening since October, the one that scared him in a way he didn't let himself fully examine. Then he thought about his own father standing in a yard not much different from this one, back in Missouri 30 years ago, watching something wrong happen and deciding the safest thing was to keep walking. His father had kept walking for the rest of his life, and Gideon had watched what that did to a man over time. Mr. Mercer. His own voice surprised him. It came out steadier than he expected. Abel Mercer turned around. He was a lean, weathered man in his late 60s with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now just permanently honest. He looked at Gideon the way you look at someone you recognize from somewhere but can't place. "Your third group," Gideon said, walking toward him, keeping his voice level. The 13 head that ran toward the east gate. Were those included in the final tally? Abel frowned. Mr. Strake counted all of them. The scale settled at 42 head on that second weighing. Gideon said, "I watched the needle. You had 49 in the pen." Silence. Not comfortable silence. The kind that precedes something breaking. Abel looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked toward the platform where Strake was still conducting business, pen moving, prices named, money changing hands in the smooth and practiced way of a man who had been doing this unchallenged for 15 years. "Son," Abel said quietly, "I don't want any trouble." "I know," Gideon said. "I'm not trying to cause you any. I just stopped." Started again. He's writing the number before the needle settles. I've watched him do it 3 times this morning. I'm not certain about your cattle specifically, but I can tell you what I saw, and you can decide what to do with it. What Abel decided, and this was the part Gideon did not anticipate, was to turn around and walk back toward the platform. Gideon followed because he couldn't think of a reasonable alternative. The confrontation that followed was not loud at first. Abel Mercer asked a simple question about the weight recorded for his second group of cattle. Strake answered with the smooth confidence of a man who had answered challenges before and watched them dissolve. He had a way of responding that made the person asking feel foolish, a particular talent. That, the ability to make your accuser feel like the problem. But Abel pointed to Gideon and said, "This man watched your scale." And that was when Strake looked at Gideon for the first time. The look lasted maybe 2 seconds. Gideon felt it the way you feel a temperature drop, not gradual but immediate, like walking from a warm room into cold air. Strake was perhaps 55 thick through the shoulders, with a well-trimmed beard that cost money to maintain, and eyes that did all the genuine thinking, while his mouth did the performing. "Who are you?" Strake said. "Gideon Rourke. I'm looking for day work." "You're looking for trouble is what you're doing." "I'm telling you what I watched," Gideon said. He could hear how the yard had gotten quieter. He could feel the attention of other ranchers, other hands, the scale operator who had gone very still. The second pen. The needle hadn't settled. "You wrote the number early." "I watched it 3 times this morning, and each time the number you wrote was lower than where the needle stopped." "You calling me a thief?" Strake's voice was still even, almost amused, but his eyes had changed into something that had no amusement in it at all. "I'm calling your scale results into question," Gideon said carefully. "There's a difference." There wasn't much difference, and both of them knew it. What happened next took about 90 seconds and could not be undone. Drake demanded a recount of Abel's cattle through the platform not because he wanted one, but because refusing it in front of 20 witnesses would have looked worse than the recount itself. The scale operator, a thin young man named Pruitt, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the earth, ran the numbers again. The discrepancy wasn't as large as Gideon's estimate. It was larger. Abel Mercer stood very still while Strake paid out the corrected difference, a sum that amounted to 2 months of the old man's basic supply costs. Strake did it with his face carefully neutral, his movements controlled, his voice smooth as he explained to the assembled yard that scale errors happened occasionally and were always corrected upon request. No one laughed. No one challenged him openly. But Gideon saw it in the faces around him, the way ranchers glanced at each other, the way several men quietly pulled out their own receipts and looked at the numbers differently than they had 5 minutes ago. Strake saw it too. When it was finished, when Abel Mercer had his corrected payment and the yard was settling back into its rhythms, Strake walked past Gideon close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He didn't stop. He didn't threaten. He said nothing at all. But the way he walked past like Gideon had already ceased to exist, like the response had been decided and implemented before Strake had even crossed the yard, told Gideon everything he needed to know. He didn't get the day work. The Clements foreman avoided his eyes when he approached and said they'd filled their spots that morning. Sorry about the ride-in. 2 other operations said the same thing within the hour. One man, a small rancher named Duffy, caught Gideon near the gate and said, very quietly, "Leave town. Today if you can manage it." He doesn't forget, and he doesn't warn twice. Gideon thanked him and didn't leave. Not that day. That was his first mistake, or at least the first one he could have avoided. He stayed because leaving felt like proving something about himself that he wasn't willing to prove. He stayed because Maisie's cough was worse, and moving a sick 8-year-old in November felt more dangerous than whatever Strake's foreman might do. He stayed because he told himself Strake was a businessman, not a criminal, and businessmen calculated consequences. And the consequences of doing anything overt to a man who'd just exposed you in a public cattle yard would be too visible to risk. He was wrong about all of it except Maisie's cough. The first thing to go was the landlord. Mr. Carver ran the boarding house, where Gideon rented 2 rooms by the week, a decent enough man who'd always taken Gideon's money without complaint and occasionally left extra bread outside the door when he heard Maisie coughing. 3 days after the cattle yard, Carver knocked with his hat in his hands and eyes that couldn't hold still and said that he was sorry, genuinely sorry, but the rooms were needed for other tenants and he'd need Gideon gone by Friday. Gideon asked if Strake had spoken to him. Carver's eyes did something complicated. "I've got a family too," he said. And that was the most honest answer Gideon got from anyone in Redwater Crossing for the rest of his time there. The ranchers who'd shown vague interest in seasonal work stopped returning his visits. The general store, where he'd had a small credit account, sent notice that the credit arrangement was no longer being offered. The blacksmith, who'd occasionally hired him for labor, had taken on a full-time assistant and had no need for extra hands. None of it was violent. None of it was even directly attributable to Strake. That was the elegant cruelty of it. Strake never touched him, never confronted him, never made a single visible threat. He simply reached out to every thread that connected Gideon Rourke to survival in Redwater Crossing and quietly pulled them loose, one at a time, with the patience of a man who understood that isolation did more damage than confrontation. Caleb knew something was wrong before Gideon told him. At 12, Caleb had his mother's instinct for trouble, a kind of atmospheric sensitivity that registered shifts in his father's mood the way animals registered weather. He'd been watching Gideon's face for 2 days when he finally said, "At dinner on Thursday evening, we're leaving, aren't we?" It wasn't a question. "Working on it," Gideon said. "We're working on that too." Caleb nodded slowly. He was a serious boy, had been since Helen died, not broken serious, not closed off, but the kind of serious that came from deciding early that the world required careful attention and that adults appreciated being helped more than being asked. He ate the rest of his meal without speaking, then cleaned the dishes without being asked, which was how Gideon knew he was frightened. Maisie had fallen asleep at the table again. She did that when her cough wore her out, just went under like a candle flame in wind, quick and complete. Gideon carried her to bed and stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to her breathe. The cough had been worsening for 6 weeks. He'd told himself it was the turning of seasons, the dry autumn air, the particular kind of childhood cold that came and went without consequence. He was still telling himself that, with less conviction each day. The riders came before dawn on Saturday, not to threaten him. They were almost polite about it, which was somehow worse than shouting. 3 of them, on good horses waiting in the street below the boarding house window, while one knocked on the front door and spoke to Carver, who came upstairs and woke Gideon with the kind of apology that meant the debt was already paid and the favor already called in. The message was simple. Gideon Rourke had until noon to be gone from Redwater Crossing. If he was still in town at noon, the sheriff, who apparently had a professional relationship with Strake that predated any loyalty to the law, would find reason to hold him, and what happened to his children during that holding would be uncertain. Gideon asked Carver to repeat the last part. Carver did. He looked sick doing it. Gideon got dressed. He woke Caleb. He wrapped Maisie in every piece of warm clothing she owned and carried her down to the wagon. The temperature outside was the kind of cold that had teeth in it, a deep November cold that Montana did better than almost anywhere, the kind that made your nose ache and your fingers slow. He had $4.20 left by then. He'd spent 40 cents on medicine for Maisie that hadn't helped. He'd loaded the wagon the night before another habit, preparing for the worst, while hoping for something else, so it only took 30 minutes to get the horse hitched and the children settled. Caleb sat up front with him, blanket across his shoulders, face doing the thing it did when he was being deliberately neutral about something that was hurting him. Maisie had gone back to sleep against a bundle of bedding in the wagon bed, her breathing audible even over the horse's movement. They left Redwater Crossing as the sky was just beginning to gray. No one watched them go. Or if they did, they watched from windows. Gideon didn't look back. He'd made that decision before the wagon moved, no looking back, because he knew himself well enough to know that if he saw that town in the morning light as he left it, something in him would want to turn around and fight the kind of fight that would only get him killed or jailed and leave his children with nothing. They drove north. Not because north was where anything was, but because the wind was coming from the northwest, and going northwest with 2 sick children in an open wagon felt like cruelty. He had a rough idea of the terrain. 7 years of working various ranches in the territory had given him a patchwork geography of the region, and he thought, if he could get to the Bitterroot Valley communities, he might find work. Might, the word doing a lot of labor in his mind. The snow started 2 hours out. Not a blizzard, but serious. The kind of steady, heavy snowfall that accumulated faster than it seemed to, that turned familiar landscape into unmarked white, that made every decision about direction feel less certain than it had an hour before. Caleb said nothing. He sat beside his father with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the trail ahead, and his jaw set in a way that made Gideon think of Helen so sharply that he had to look away. Maisie coughed in her sleep. The sound of it went through Gideon like wire. He knew he couldn't keep driving into the snow with her like that. He knew the horse was tiring. He knew $4.20 wouldn't get them to any settlement large enough to have a doctor before the weather turned genuinely dangerous. He knew all of this with the particular clarity that came when a man ran out of ways to tell himself things were manageable. What he knew about this stretch of country riding through it 2 winters back, trailing cattle for the Hammond operation, was that there was a large ranch somewhere to the northeast, a well-established operation. He remembered the gate, distinctive ironwork at the top of it, remembered thinking the owner had money, and the kind of money that didn't need to announce itself constantly. He didn't know who owned it. He didn't know if they'd turn him away. He turned the wagon northeast. Maisie coughed again, longer this time. "Pop," Caleb said quietly. "I know," Gideon said. "I know." He drove faster. The gate appeared out of the white landscape, like something he'd imagined the ironwork catching, what little light came through the snow clouds. The lane beyond it leading to a house with lit windows. Actual lit windows, warm yellow through the gray morning, the most welcome sight Gideon Rourke had seen in 2 months. He sat the wagon in front of that gate for a moment, long enough for Caleb to look at him with a question on his face. Long enough for Maisie to cough once more and for the sound of it to settle the question before he'd consciously made it. He climbed down and knocked. He didn't know yet what was on the other side of that gate. He didn't know about Lenora Ashford or Ironwood Crown Ranch or what the next months would cost both of them. He didn't know that the decision he was making in this exact moment, knocking on a stranger's gate in a snowstorm with a sick child and 20 cents to spare, was the decision that would eventually cost Vernon Strake everything. He just knocked and waited. And somewhere inside the house, a lamp moved. The lamp moved, and then there was the sound of boots on wood flooring, and then silence. And Gideon stood at that gate in the snow, with his hat pulled low and his collar up, his hands going numb inside his gloves, and he thought, very clearly, if they turn me away, I have no plan after this. He had not let himself think that on the drive over. He'd kept his mind on the task, navigate the snow, keep the horse moving, find the gate. Tasks were manageable. The absence of a plan beyond the gate was not something he could afford to examine while he was still driving toward it. But now he was here, and the examination was unavoidable, and the answer was the same no matter how he looked at it. There was no plan after this. The gate was iron, heavy, the kind built to last generations. Through it he could see the lane leading toward the house, and the house itself was substantial, not ostentatious, but built with serious intent, the kind of construction that said whoever put this up expected it to stand for 100 years and planned accordingly. The lit windows were on the ground floor. He could see movement behind the glass. Then the front door opened, and someone came out onto the porch. Not a ranch hand, not a foreman. A woman, which was not what he'd expected, though afterward he couldn't have explained exactly what he had expected. She was carrying a lamp in one hand and moving with the particular purposefulness of someone who'd been woken unexpectedly and was not pleased about it, but was going to deal with whatever the situation was regardless. She stopped at the porch railing and looked toward the gate. Who's out there? Her voice carried well in the cold air. Not frightened. Not welcoming either. Just asking. Gideon Rourke, he called back. I've got 2 children in the wagon. My daughter's sick. I'm not asking for much, just somewhere warm for tonight, and I'll work for it. Whatever you need done. I'm good with horses, fencing, repairs. I'm not, he stopped. Started again, I'm not dangerous. I just need one night. A long pause. The woman on the porch held the lamp a little higher, like she was trying to see him better through the snow and distance. He couldn't make out her face clearly. He could make out that she wasn't moving toward the gate, which meant the answer wasn't automatically yes, and it also wasn't automatically no. And that was more than he'd had 30 seconds ago. How old's the child? She called. 8. She's had a cough since October. The cold's made it worse. Another pause. Shorter this time. Gate's not locked, she said. Pull the wagon around to the barn. I'll meet you there. She went back inside before he could say, thank you. He stood there for a second anyway, because his legs had gone a little unreliable, the way legs, tension that had been holding you upright for the past several hours, suddenly had permission to relax. Then he got back on the wagon. We're in? Caleb said. For tonight, Gideon said. For tonight. The barn was warm with the particular warmth of horses and hay and closed space, a warmth that had nothing elegant about it and everything right. Gideon got Maisie out of the wagon, while Caleb started unhitching the horse. The boy had learned to do that efficiently over the past year, one of several practical things he'd absorbed without being explicitly taught, as though he'd decided that competence was the best protection available to him. Maisie stirred when Gideon lifted her, opened her eyes, coughed twice, and then registered the warmth of the barn and made a small, involuntary sound of relief that went straight through him. Are we somewhere? She asked. We're somewhere, he said. The woman came into the barn a few minutes later. She was dressed now, boots, heavy coat, her dark hair pulled back in the practical way of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in a hurry and didn't spend time thinking about it. She was younger than he'd expected from her voice, early 30s maybe, with the kind of face that showed everything the weather had done to it over years of outdoor work and nothing it hadn't earned. She looked at Maisie first, the way people with any instinct looked at a sick child, and her expression shifted slightly from the careful neutral she'd been wearing. Let me see her, she said. It wasn't a request exactly, but it wasn't aggressive either. It was the tone of someone who was used to making assessments and acting on them. She put her hand against Maisie's forehead, then gently pressed her fingers along the child's jaw and neck, then listened to her breathing with the focused attention of someone who knew what she was listening for. She's not burning up, she said. That's good. The cough, is it wet or dry? Mostly dry, Gideon said. Some mornings it's worse. How long since she's slept somewhere properly warm? He thought about that honestly. 3 weeks, maybe. She looked at him then directly, and he had the distinct feeling of being assessed in the same efficient way she'd assessed Maisie. It wasn't unkind. It was simply thorough. I'm Lenora Ashford, she said. This is Ironwood Crown. You said you can work. Yes, ma'am. Don't call me ma'am. I'm not old enough for it, and it makes me feel like I'm being managed. She said it flatly, without irritation, as though it was simply a preference she'd stated many times and found more efficient to clarify up front. What kind of work? Horses, fencing, repairs mostly. I can handle cattle drives. I'm good with equipment. I've done blacksmithing assistance. I can cook well enough to feed working hands. You said one night. That's what I'm asking for. She looked at Maisie again. Then at Caleb, who was watching the exchange from near the horse's head with his careful eyes and his hands occupied with the brushing down he'd started because he needed something to do, and this was useful. You can sleep in the barn tonight, Lenora said. There's a stove in the tack room that'll keep it warm enough. I'll have someone bring food in the morning. She paused. Your daughter should be inside, not in a barn. I'm not asking I know what you're asking for, she said, with a patience that had a firm edge to it. I'm telling you what makes sense. A sick child in a barn in November doesn't make sense. I have a spare room. She can sleep inside. You and the boy can stay in the tack room. Gideon opened his mouth, closed it. He was aware that he was about to argue with a woman who was offering him exactly what he needed, because accepting it completely felt like more obligation than he'd earned, which was the kind of pride that made absolutely no practical sense in his current situation. Thank you, he said instead. Lenora Ashford nodded once, like the matter was settled, which it was. Come on then, she said to Maisie, holding out her hand. Let's get you somewhere that doesn't smell like horses. Maisie looked at her father. He nodded. She took Lenora's hand without ceremony, which surprised him. Maisie had been careful around strangers since Helen died, the kind of careful that looked like shyness, but was actually more deliberate than that. She took Lenora's hand and went with her, and that was the first thing that happened at Ironwood Crown that Gideon couldn't quite explain. He lay awake in the tack room for a long time that night, listening to Caleb's breathing even out into sleep beside him, listening to the horses shift and settle, listening to the wind work at the barn walls. The stove was doing its job. It was warmer than anywhere he'd slept in 3 weeks, and his body wanted to surrender to that warmth completely, but his mind kept moving. He kept thinking about Strake's riders in the street before dawn, about Carver's eyes, about the way Duffy had said, leave town of a man with the particular tone of man who'd watched other people not leave town and knew what happened to them. He kept thinking about the cattle yard and whether he'd have done anything differently if he could go back. And the honest answer was no, which was both a comfort and a problem, because it meant that given the same choice again, he'd make the same decision and end up in the same tack room. He thought about the woman who'd taken his daughter's hand without hesitation. He was up before dawn. That was the habit of 15 years of ranch work. The body didn't care that circumstances had changed. It woke when it was supposed to wake and expected to be put to work. He dressed quietly, left Caleb sleeping, and went out into the barn. The snow had stopped overnight. The world outside the barn doors was the kind of white, and still that happened after heavy snowfall, clean in a way that felt slightly accusatory after the past week. He was not planning to look for problems. He was genuinely not planning it. He was planning to windows were dark. He was planning to tend to his own horse, check the wagon, and wait for morning to be underway enough that he could thank Lenora Ashford properly and figure out his next direction. But a ranch at dawn speaks to anyone who knows how to listen to one. The water pump on the side of the main barn was the first thing he heard, or rather, the sound it wasn't making. A working pump had a rhythm, a reliable mechanical voice that was part of the morning soundscape of any functioning operation. This one was making a different sound, an intermittent grinding complaint that meant something in the mechanism was close to failing. He looked at it without touching it for about a minute, running through the possibilities. It wasn't complicated. The pivot arm was wearing, and the leather seal was probably dried and cracking, and neither of those was an expensive fix if you caught it before the whole thing seized. He'd caught it before it seized. He found tools in the tack room, a well-organized tack room, he noticed, which told him something about whoever maintained it, and he spent the better part of an hour and a half on the pump before it was running the way it was supposed to run. He didn't plan to tell anyone. He did it because leaving a failing pump alone when he could see exactly what it needed and had the tools to fix it felt like a form of dishonesty he wasn't capable of. He was cleaning his hands on a rag when he heard boots behind him. That pump has been making that noise for 3 weeks, Lenora said. She was standing a few feet away, coffee cup in one hand, watching him with an expression he couldn't read clearly. I told Dolan to look at it. He said it was fine. It wasn't fine, Gideon said. The pivot arm was wearing, and the seal needed oiling. Another week, and it would have seized completely. I know, she said. I knew it wasn't fine. Dolan told me it was fine because he didn't want to do it. She paused. Why did you do it? He thought about how to answer that, honestly. I heard it. When I came out this morning, I could see what it needed. Leaving it seemed wrong. She looked at him for another moment. Then she held out the second cup he hadn't noticed she was carrying. He took it. She said, "Come eat something before you figure out where you're going." Breakfast was at the kitchen table, which he hadn't expected. He'd expected to be fed in the barn or on the porch, the way hands usually were when they weren't established members of the crew. The kitchen was large, practical, with the particular organization of someone who cooked seriously and expected the kitchen to function as a workspace rather than a showpiece. Maisie was already at the table, looking better than she had in weeks' color in her face, the shadows under her eyes softened by actual sleep, her small hands wrapped around a cup of warm milk. She was talking, which was the most reliable indicator of Maisie's condition. When she was sick enough to stop talking, it was serious. She was telling Lenora about the cattle yard. Gideon stopped in the doorway. Not because he wanted to stop the conversation, there was nothing in it that required protecting, but because he hadn't expected Maisie to tell it. And he found himself listening to his 8-year-old daughter describe the scene at the Redwater cattle yard with a precision that was slightly unnerving. She'd been at the boarding house when it happened. She knew the story only from what she'd heard him say to Caleb, and she was telling it back with details in the right order and the emotional weight in the right places. And Pa knew the numbers were wrong, Maisie was saying, because he's good at numbers. He taught me to do numbers in my head, and I can do them pretty fast now. Can I show you? After breakfast, Lenora said, glancing up and seeing Gideon in the doorway. He came in and sat down. Caleb arrived a few minutes later, having done a complete and unsolicited check of the barn animals before coming to eat, which Lenora appeared to register without comment. She put food in front of all of them and sat with her own coffee and watched Gideon's children eat with an expression that was not sentimental exactly, but not uninvolved either. How long were you in Redwater? She asked him. 14 months. Before that, Hargrove Ranch down near Millbrook. 3 years. Before that, Hammond Operation, 2 years. I've been working this territory since my wife and I came up from Missouri. Your wife, she died last year. A pause. Not awkward. Lenora wasn't the kind of person who filled silence with noise. I'm sorry, she said, and that was all she said, which was exactly the right amount. They talked about the territory, about cattle prices, about the Stonehaven market that a few ranchers had been discussing as an alternative to the established Redwater buyers. Lenora knew the market well, better than he'd expected, better than most ranchers he'd worked for knew their own financial terrain. She spoke about it with the fluency of someone who'd done serious research rather than relying on word of mouth. And she spoke about Strake's network with a particular flatness that told him she'd had her own interactions with the man. He's approached you, Gideon said. It wasn't quite a question. 3 times, she said. He wants Ironwood Crown's volume. Most of its windows were dark. This operation is large enough to be worth his attention, and I've been routing independently, which means I'm a loose thread he'd like to tie off. She set down her coffee cup. The last time his representative came out, I had him escorted off the property before he finished his opening sentence. That would have annoyed Strake, Gideon said. That was the intention. He looked at her across the table. You know he'll move against you eventually. I know, she said. I've known for a while. The question is timing and the question is leverage. She looked out the window at the snow-covered yard. I don't have enough of either right now. He stayed that day because the pump led to the fencing, and the fencing led to 3 horses that were showing signs of being badly managed. And by late afternoon, he'd been working for 8 hours without quite intending to, and Lenora Ashford had watched about 3 hours of it from various distances without saying anything to stop him. The fencing problem was more serious than the pump. 2 sections on the western pasture were not going to survive a heavy winter. The posts were rotting at the base. The wire was improperly tensioned, and someone had done a patching job in at least 4 places that was going to pull loose under the first real ice load. He didn't say anything about it at dinner. He just went to bed in the tack room again and got up the next morning and started on the first section before the ranch hands were out of their quarters. That was when he met Dolan. Roy Dolan was the senior hand at Ironwood Crown, which meant he'd been there the longest and had opinions about what that entitled him to. He was a compact man in his 40s with a sun-damaged face and the kind of confident carelessness that came from years of not being corrected. He found Gideon at the western fence at about 7 in the morning and stood watching him work for almost 2 full minutes before speaking. Who told you to do that? Dolan said. Nobody, Gideon said without stopping. Spotted it yesterday. Figured I'd fix it before the ice comes. Miss Ashford says where fencing gets done. You're right, Gideon said. I'll talk to her about it. You'll talk to me about it. I run the hands on this property. Gideon paused then, which wasn't because he felt he needed to, but because he wanted to look at Dolan properly before responding. He'd met Dolan's before. Every ranch had one eventually, the senior hand who'd been there long enough to believe seniority was the same as authority, who resented any efficiency that hadn't come through him, who processed outside competence as a personal threat rather than a resource. "I'm not a hand here," Gideon said. "I'm a visitor who's fixing a fence because it needs fixing. When it's done, I'll tell Miss Ashford what I did, and she can decide if she's grateful or not." Dolan's jaw tightened. "You watch yourself," he said. "Always do," Gideon said, and went back to the fence. He told Lenora about the exchange that evening, not to complain about Dolan, but because she had a right to know what was happening on her own property. He laid it out plainly, what he'd observed about the fence, what Dolan had said, what the fencing job looked like before and after. He didn't editorialize. He let her reach her own conclusions. She reached them faster than he expected. "How long do you think Dolan's been doing substandard work?" she asked. "Minimum a year based on what I can see. Probably longer. And the other hands?" "Two of them follow his lead. The younger one, the red-haired kid, Fletcher. He actually knows what he's doing. He's just been told to do it wrong." Lenora was quiet for a moment. She had that quality, he was realizing, of processing information completely before responding, which made conversations with her feel different than most. Most people were already formulates their response while you were still talking. She actually listened first. "He told me the fence was fine in September," she said. "The fence was not fine in September." "No," she said. "It wasn't." She looked at him steadily. "I need to ask you something directly." "All right, you've been here 2 days. You fixed the pump. You've done 2 sections of fencing. You've spent half an hour with the bay mare I've been unable to get anyone to handle. You're not asking for permanent work. You're not pushing to stay. What are you actually doing?" It was a fair question. A smart question, actually, the kind that deserved a straight answer. "I'm paying for the night," he said. "Except I've been here 2 nights, and I've fixed more than 1 night's worth of things, and I'm aware of that imbalance, and it bothers me. So I keep working until the balance feels right. That's an unusual way to operate. It's the only way I know how to." She studied him for another long moment. "I'll offer you 2 weeks of work," she said. "Fair wages, room and board for you and your children. I need the rest of that western fence done. I need someone I can trust to tell me what they actually see rather than what's easiest to say. And your daughter needs more than 2 nights of warmth." She paused. "That's not charity. I need the work done and you can do it. Those are the terms." He thought about Duff telling him to leave. He thought about Strake's riders in the street. He thought about the fact that accepting 2 weeks' work at Ironwood Crown put him closer to Strake's territory, not further from it, and that Lenora Ashford's independent operation was exactly the kind of thing that attracted Strake's attention. He thought about Maisie's color this morning, about Caleb finding excuses to be near the horses every available hour. 2 weeks, he said. He did not plan to stay longer than that. Maisie had her numbers organized by the end of the first week. That was the thing about Maisie: give her a project and a reason for it. And she moved on it with a focus that was slightly alarming in an 8-year-old. She'd found the cattle weight record books in the office, 3 years of them, disorganized, in the way records got disorganized when the person keeping them was competent at ranching, but had no particular interest in clerical systems. By day 3, she had them sorted chronologically. By day 5, she had started a new ledger that cross-referenced weight records against sale dates and prices. Lenora found her at the office desk on the afternoon of the 5th day and stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. "I found some numbers that don't match," Maisie said, without looking up. "From 2 years ago. The weight was recorded one way in this book and different in this other book." Lenora came over and looked at what she was pointing at. She was quiet for a moment. "That's the record from the Strake yard," she said. "And that's my copy of what I had before we got there." "They're different," Maisie said. "Yes," Lenora said. "They are." She looked at the 2 numbers for another moment. Then, at this small, serious girl who had found in 5 days what Lenora hadn't had the organizational system to find in 2 years. "Maisie," she said carefully, "can you show me every place in these books where the numbers don't match?" "I already started that list," Maisie said, and produced a separate sheet of paper. Lenora sat down. The list was longer than she'd expected. Outside, Gideon was working on the barn roof. A section of it had been improperly repaired at some point and was sitting wrong, storing ice in a way that would cause collapse under the wrong load. He'd mentioned it to Lenora on day 4. She'd said fix it, and now he was up there in the cold doing a job that Dolan had been ignoring since at least the previous risk, based on the condition of the materials. He heard her come out of the house. He heard the particular quality of her footsteps that meant she was thinking hard about something. Your daughter found something, she called up to him. What kind of something? The useful kind. He came down off the roof. She showed him the list. He read it carefully, then read it again. This is Strake, he said. It has to be. These are all weights recorded at his yard. He's been doing it to you too. For at least 2 years, she said, that I can document. Gideon looked at the list, then at the house where Maisie was presumably still working, then at Lenora. If she's found 2 years of this for you, Abel Mercer probably has similar records. Other ranchers who've run through Strake's yard, they'd have their own copies, Lenora said. And if they compared them to what was recorded at the yard, you'd have a pattern, Gideon said. Not just one incident, a systematic pattern. They looked at each other across the cold yard. This was the moment, though neither of them named it as such. This was the point where the thing Gideon had started in the Redwater cattle yard, a small public challenge, one honest man refusing to look away, found the larger shape it had been building toward. The pump fix had become the fencing. The fencing had exposed Dolan. Maisie's organized mind had found something that had been hidden in plain sight for 2 years. And now here they were, standing in the snow with a list in their hands that could do serious damage to Vernon Strake's operation, if they were careful about how they used it. Gideon's 2 weeks were almost up. He knew it. He suspected she knew it. Dolan needs to go, he said, not because it was urgent to the moment, but because it was also true and had been since day 2. I know, Lenora said. I've known he's been running things badly. I've been getting pushback on it, from men who think a woman who inherited a ranch doesn't know what good work looks like. You know what good work looks like? I do, she said, without defensiveness. I've always known. But knowing and being able to enforce it are different things when half your hands have decided your authority is provisional. Fire Dolan, Gideon said. Promote Fletcher. The other 2 will either fall in line or leave, and if they leave, you're better off without them anyway. That's simple. That's simple, he said. It's never comfortable, but it's not complicated. She fired Dolan the next morning. Gideon wasn't there. For it, he stayed deliberately away from the conversation, because it wasn't his conversation to be part of, and showing up as background support would have undermined the authority that needed to be demonstrated. He heard afterward from Fletcher that Dolan had said several things about Lenora, that Fletcher repeated with visible embarrassment, and that Lenora had listened to all of it and then told Dolan to be off the property before noon. He was off the property before 10. The 2 hands who'd followed Dolan's lead watched which way the wind was blowing and decided to fall in line. People usually did, Gideon had found, when the alternative was packing their own things. 2 weeks became 3. 3 became 5. Gideon told himself it was because the barn roof project had expanded into a related drainage problem that needed resolution before winter fully hit, which was true. He told himself it was because Maisie's cough had improved enough in the warm and consistent environment that moving her again felt medically unwise, which was also true. He told himself Lenora needed someone she could trust planning, which was becoming more urgent. As word reached them through Fletcher's cousin in Redwater, a reliable informal intelligence network, that Strake had started asking questions about Ironwood Crownsman plans. All of those things were true. None of them were the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated, and he wasn't ready to examine it directly, because examining it directly would require acknowledging things he'd made the practical ascensions made for himself, more complicated than they already were. Caleb was the one who said it, because Caleb had his mother's habit of stating obvious truths at inconvenient moments. He said it on a Thursday evening when they were walking back from the eastern pasture, just the 2 of them. The sun going down in the way Montana sunsets went down in late November, fast and orange and cold. Pa, Caleb said. Are we staying? We're working, Gideon said. That's not what I asked. Gideon was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said finally, because Caleb deserved honesty more than comfort, and he always had. Caleb nodded, looking at the ground in front of him as he walked. Maisie thinks we're staying, he said. She told Miss Ashford she was going to redo the records for all 3 years. Not just find the discrepancies. That's a month of work at least. I know. She's happy here, Caleb said. I don't mean happy, I mean she's the way she was before Mom. That's the first time since Mom. Gideon stopped walking. Caleb stopped a step later and turned to look at him. I know, Gideon said again, and the words were doing a lot more work than their size suggested. Caleb looked at him steadily. He had that look sometimes, too old for his face, the look of a boy who'd grown up faster than children should have to, and had made a kind of separate peace with that fact. It's okay to let it be good, he said. That's what Mom used to say. It's okay to let it be good. He walked on ahead toward the house. Gideon stood in the pasture a moment longer. The orange had gone out of the sky while they were talking. The cold was coming down properly now, the way it came down after dark in November, settling into everything. He walked back toward the house. The kitchen window was lit. He could see Maisie at the table with her ledger books. He could see Lenora across from her, saying something that made Maisie look up and laugh, a real laugh, the full one, the one he hadn't heard enough of in 14 months. He stood outside that warm window in the cold for a moment before going in. He thought about the list of weight discrepancies. He thought about Strake asking questions about Ironwood Crown. He thought about the fact that being here, being useful here, was exactly the kind of thing that would eventually draw Strake's attention to this woman. He'd brought Strake's enemy status with him when he came through that gate, tucked in alongside his children and his $4.20, and he hadn't fully reckoned with what that meant for Lenora Ashford. He should probably tell her that. He went inside. The kitchen was warm. Maisie looked up from her ledger and said, "Pa, come look at this. I found 3 more from 1,887 with the urgency of someone who'd made a discovery that needed immediate witnesses." He sat down at the table. Lenora was watching him with an expression that was careful and direct, and not quite neutral, the same expression she'd worn that first morning when she'd handed him coffee and asked why he'd fixed the pump. He looked back at her for a moment. Then he looked at the ledger Maisie was pointing at and listened to his daughter explain what she'd found, and somewhere in the back of his mind the pieces of what was coming. Strake's next move, the Stonehaven contract, the Mountain Pass, all of it were already beginning to assemble themselves into a shape he couldn't quite see yet, but could feel at the edges, the way you felt weather coming before it arrived. Outside, the wind picked up. The gate at the end of the lane stood closed against the dark, but inside the lamp burned steadily. And for the first time in longer than Gideon could accurately count, he did not feel like a man running out of road. The rumors reached Ironwood Crown on a Wednesday, carried by Fletcher's cousin, who rode out from Redwater with a look on his face like a man delivering bad news he'd been paid not to deliver. His name was Arvid, a thin, young man who worked at the general store and had the nervous energy of someone who processed too much information daily and couldn't always decide what to do with it. He arrived at the ranch just after midday, asked for Fletcher specifically, and the two of them talked near the water trough for about 10 minutes before Fletcher came to find Gideon at the equipment shed, where he was working on a wagon axle that had been grinding wrong since the first week. "Arvid says there's talk in town," Fletcher said. He was a decent young man, Fletcher, maybe 22, with the red hair and the direct eyes of someone who'd decided early that the most efficient way through life was to say things plainly. "About you and Miss Ashford." Gideon set down the wrench. "What kind of talk?" "The kind Strake's men started." Fletcher shifted his weight. "They're saying you came here and talked your way into the house because you knew she was a wealthy woman alone, and you saw an opportunity. But most of its windows were dark. They're saying you've got her convinced you're doing her a favor while you position yourself to claim interest in the property." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Who's hearing this?" he said. "Everybody. The supply merchants in Redwater, the smaller ranching families out east. Her cousins in Millbrook, apparently Arvid says someone sent them a letter, unofficial, just concerned neighbors wanting the family to know what kind of man had settled himself into their relations' property. Her cousins, 2 of them. They're coming out next week from what Arvid heard, to check on her." Gideon picked the wrench back up and looked at the axle without seeing it. The mechanics of what Strake had done were clean. He had to give the man that. Direct intimidation hadn't worked on Lenora. She'd thrown his representative off the property before the opening sentence was finished. Physical pressure on Gideon had only accelerated things. So now Strake was working the one angle that didn't require confrontation, social erosion. Make the community question Lenora's judgment. Make her family nervous. Make the ranchers, who might follow her to Stonehaven, wonder whether the woman they'd be following was being manipulated by a drifter with an agenda. It was elegant, and it was dirty, and it was exactly the kind of thing that worked on people who were already uncertain. "Does Miss Ashford know?" Gideon asked. "Not yet," Fletcher said. "I came to you first." "Don't," Gideon said. "Come to her first next time. Always." He set down the wrench properly this time, wiping his hands. "I'll tell her." He found Lenora in the office, which was where she spent most afternoons now, not because she'd been spending more time on administrative work, but because Maisie had reorganized the space so thoroughly that it had become genuinely functional for the first time in years. And Lenora had discovered that she actually liked running the numbers, when the numbers were arranged in a way that made sense. She looked up when Gideon came in, read his expression, and put down her pen. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it, including the cousins, including the letter to Millbrook. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, with the focused stillness that he'd stopped finding unusual and started finding steadying. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "My cousins' names are Harold and Warren Ashford," she said finally. "Harold thinks women should manage households, not ranches. Warren hasn't decided yet, but tends to follow Harold. They've been looking for a reason to suggest I sell Ironwood Crown to one of them since my father died 3 years ago. And now they have a reason," Gideon said. "Now they have a letter from an unnamed concerned neighbor suggesting their unmarried female cousin is being taken advantage of by a widower with 2 children and no permanent address." She said it flatly, without self-pity, but he could hear what was underneath the flatness, which is exactly the kind of story Harold will build a case from. "I should leave," Gideon said. Lenora looked at him directly. "Why?" "Because my being here is the thing Strake is using against you. If I go, he loses the narrative." "If you go," she said, "I lose the only person on this property who's told me the truth consistently for 6 weeks. My daughter's records are unfinished, my fence is half done, and Strake wins without even having to do anything difficult." She picked up her pen again, then set it down again, which was the closest he'd seen her come to a gesture of frustration. "I don't make decisions based on what makes Vernon Strake comfortable." "This isn't about his comfort," Gideon said. "This is about your reputation in this community and your family's confidence in your judgment. And those things matter for what you're trying to build with the Stonehaven contract." "You're right that they matter," she said. "You're wrong that you leaving fixes them. The story exists now whether you're here or not. Leaving looks like confirmation." He hadn't thought of it that way. He stood there recalculating. She was right. Leaving now didn't erase the rumor. It gave the rumor shape, the drifter who'd been exposed and cleared out, which implied there had been something to expose. Staying and being visibly, professionally functional was a better argument than absence. "Your cousins are going to be a problem," he said. "Harold has always been a problem," she said. "I've been managing Harold since I was 19. Warren follows Harold until someone gives him a better option." She looked at him steadily. "I need the Stonehaven contract finalized before they get here. If I can show them a signed 3-year agreement with the Stonehaven buyers, they can't argue the ranch is in jeopardy. Numbers are the one language Harold actually speaks. How long do we have? 8 days until they arrive. The drive to Stonehaven takes 5 days minimum in good conditions, longer if the weather turns." She spread a map on the desk, a detailed map of the territory, with handwritten notations in at least 3 different inks from different years. "The standard route is here through Carver Pass, down the Eastern Valley. Strake's buyers work that corridor. He'll know the minute we start moving cattle toward it. He'll move to block the deal," Gideon said. "He's probably already moving. He has contacts with the Stonehaven merchants he supplies. He'll tell them Ironwood Crown is an unreliable operation, question my ability to fulfill a 3-year contract, suggest there are management problems." She traced a different line on the map with her finger, the logging route. "Here." He leaned over and looked at it. The line ran northeast along the ridge before cutting through a mountain corridor he didn't recognize by name. "That's been abandoned for years. 12 years. The logging operation shut down and nobody's run cattle through it since. But the grade is manageable and it cuts 2 days off the journey if you know where the trail holds." She looked up at him. My father used it twice in the late 70s. I've ridden it once, 3 years ago, to see if it was still viable. It is, barely. It needs someone who can read terrain and make decisions fast. Strake won't expect it, Gideon said slowly. He's watching the standard routes. He won't even know we're moving until we're already through the pass. When would we leave? 4 days, she said. We can't wait longer than that and still beat the cousins back with a signed contract. 4 days wasn't much time to prepare a cattle drive on a route that hadn't been used in over a decade. Gideon knew that, and Lenora knew it, and they both chose not to say it out loud because saying it out loud would require them to discuss the alternative, which was waiting and watching Strake dismantle the situation from a distance while Harold Ashford arrived to helpfully suggest that his unmarried cousin sell the ranch. I'll need to ride the first section of the logging route tomorrow, Gideon said. Check what the trail looks like now versus what your memory says. I'll go with you. You don't need to. I know the trail, she said simply. You don't. We'll lose half a day if you go alone and find something I could have told you in advance. He acknowledged the logic of that and said nothing further about it. They rode out before sunrise the next morning, just the two of them, leaving Fletcher in charge of the ranch, with instructions that covered most contingencies. The logging trail was harder to find than Lenora had made it sound, not because her directions were imprecise, but because 12 years of weather and growth had done considerable work on the markers. What had been a clear break in the line was now overgrown enough to look like ordinary forest until you were right at the edge of it and could see the old skid road running beneath the new undergrowth. The trail itself was worse than either of them said to each other for the first 2 hours. The grade was manageable where it ran along the ridge, but there were 3 sections where erosion had eaten into the path enough that moving cattle through without losses would require careful herding and probably some improvised fencing to guide the animals away from the drop-off. Gideon marked each problem section in his mind, thinking through solutions, while Lenora rode slightly ahead through the narrower stretches because she remembered the layout better and it made practical sense for her to lead. They stopped at the ridge overlook, where the trail broke open into a wider section, with a clear view of the valley below and the mountain corridor that would take them toward Stonehaven. The sky was the kind of clear that came between winter storms, sharp and cold and too blue, the kind of day that made Montana look like something a painter had invented. It's possible, Gideon said, looking at the terrain. I know it's possible, Lenora said. The question was whether it was possible with the herd we'd be moving. 200 head? 212, the strongest ones. We need 4 reliable hands minimum. Fletcher and 3 others. Fletcher, Carson, and the Brant brothers if they'll come. They're freelance, but they're good. I know the Brant brothers by reputation. They're good. He looked at the narrow corridor below them. We need to move the cattle through that section before dark on day 3. Once we're past it, we're on the eastern grade, and it opens up. And if the weather turns before day 3. He was quiet for a moment. We deal with that if it happens. She looked at him sidelong. That's not an answer? No, he said. It's not. The honest answer is that if the weather turns hard before we're through the corridor, we're in genuine trouble, and I don't have a solution for that beyond hoping the forecast holds. He looked at her. I don't give you answers I can't back up. She held his gaze for a moment. I know, she said. That's one of approximately 4 things I actually trust about this situation. What are the other 3? She looked back at the valley below them. Maisie's numbers are accurate. Fletcher does what he says he'll do. And if something goes wrong on this trail, you won't abandon the cattle to save yourself. He wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he didn't respond to it directly. We should head back, he said. I need to start on the fencing guides for the erosion sections. They rode back in the late afternoon light, mostly in a comfortable silence that had developed between them over the past weeks without either of them quite deciding to develop it, the kind of silence that happened between people who had spent enough working time together that words became optional for the things that didn't require them. He was working through the logistics in his head. She was doing the same, he suspected, because occasionally she'd say something like the water crossing on day 2 or we'll need extra rope for the narrow section. And he'd respond with his thinking on it, and they'd absorb each other's input and go back to silence. It was not the easiest way he'd ever planned a cattle drive. He realized somewhere on the ride back The first one he'd planned with someone who understood the full operation as well as he did, and had an actual stake in the outcome that went beyond wages. Helen had understood livestock and weather and hard work, but she'd never had the particular kind of ranching knowledge that Lenora carried. The realization sat with him uncomfortably, not because it felt like disloyalty to Helen, but because it felt like something he hadn't expected to find again and wasn't quite prepared for. He put it aside. There was too much practical work ahead to afford the distraction. The preparation for the drive consumed the next 3 days completely. Gideon and Fletcher did 2 full days of cattle selection and management. We're cutting the strongest 212 head from the larger herd, getting them used to moving together, checking every animal for soundness of leg and hoof that might become a problem on mountain terrain. The Brandt brothers, Eli and Samuel, arrived on the second day and proved worth their reputation. They worked without complaint, absorbed instructions quickly, and had the particular quality of experienced hands who understood that a successful drive required everyone doing their job without ego getting in the way. Maisie finished the discrepancy records on day 2 of the preparation. She came to find Gideon at the cattle pen with the completed ledger under her arm and a look on her face that was part pride and part the particular seriousness she wore when she felt the information she was carrying was important. "I found them all," she said, "all 3 years. 41 separate transactions where the numbers don't match. I wrote them in order by date, and I put the difference next to each one, so you can see the total." He took the ledger and looked at the total. He looked at it for a long time. "Maisie," he said carefully, "did you check this number?" 3 times, she said. "It's right, Pa." He showed it to Lenora that evening. She sat with it for a while without speaking. "That's just my records," she said finally. "That's just what he stole from Ironwood Crown. Multiply it across 15 years and the number of ranchers who've run through his yard," Gideon said. She closed the ledger. Her expression had gone very still, the kind of still that was not calm, but was containing in something that needed containing. "I want to take this to Stonehaven," she said. "Not just the contract. This documentation. I want the buyers to see it, and I want to find out if they know anyone in the territorial court system." "An attorney," Gideon said. "A very thorough attorney," she said. "One who isn't afraid of Strake's connections. Those are rare. I know, but they exist." She opened the ledger again and looked at the total one more time. "I want him to have to pay this back, not just the money. I want the system he built on this to come down. He understood that. He understood it the way you understood something that was both right and dangerous, not because the goal was wrong, but because reaching for it meant committing to a fight that would get uglier before it resolved. "Let's get the contract first," he said. "One thing at a time." She looked at him steadily. "One thing at a time," she agreed. They left before dawn on the 4th morning. 212 cattle, 5 riders, a supply wagon driven by the ranch's cook, Addie, a 60-year-old woman with forearms like rope and an apparent indifference to weather that Gideon found both impressive and slightly unsettling. Lenora rode at the front. Gideon worked the right flank. Fletcher and Eli Brandt handled the left. Samuel Brandt rode drag, which was the worst position in any cattle drive behind the herd, eating their dust, or in this case their churned snow, and did it without complaint. The first day went well, which Gideon distrusted almost immediately. Good first days on difficult drives had a way of creating false confidence that punished you later. The logging trail entrance was harder to navigate with the full herd than it had been with just 2 horses. The cattle were uncertain about the tree line, the ones at the front stopping and requiring encouragement, while the ones behind pressed forward, creating the predictable accordion problem of a herd that couldn't see where it was going and didn't like the answer when it got there. It took almost 2 hours to get the full group onto the trail and moving. 2 hours of controlled chaos that left everyone's nerves worn and the horses irritable. But they got through. The first problem materialized on the afternoon of the second day. One of the erosion sections Gideon had marked was worse than he'd remembered from the scouting ride. The edge had given way further, possibly from a freeze and thaw cycle since they'd ridden through, leaving a gap that was genuinely dangerous for cattle who weren't being carefully guided. He and Eli Brandt spent 90 minutes constructing a rope guide fence to direct the animals away from the drop, while Fletcher and Samuel moved the herd through in smaller groups, 20 at a time, controlled and slow. Lenora worked beside Gideon on the guide fence without being asked, which he'd stopped expecting her to ask to do. She understood rope work, actually understood it, not as a management oversight, but as someone who'd done it with her hands, and between them, they had the structure up faster than he'd have managed alone. "You've done fence work before," he said, not accusingly, just observing. "My father made me learn everything," she said. He didn't believe in a rancher who couldn't do every job on the ranch. Said if you didn't know how it was done, you could be told anything about whether it was done right. She secured a knot with the particular efficiency of someone for whom the motion was completely automatic. He was right about that. He was right about a lot, sounds like, Gideon said. He was wrong about some things too, she said. He thought I'd eventually want to sell and go east and live in a city. He kept waiting for it. She looked at the rope fence, checking the tension. Never happened. Did he see that coming? By the end, she said. I think by the end he knew I'd run this place until I couldn't anymore. A pause. He left it to me instead of my cousins because he trusted me. I've never wanted to do anything except prove that trust was correctly placed. Gideon thought about Harold and Warren Ashford heading toward Ironwood Crown right now. About the letter from the unnamed concerned neighbor. About the particular way powerful men constructed reality around the women who inconvenienced them. It was correctly placed, he said. She looked at him briefly with an expression he couldn't fully interpret, and then went back to checking the rope tension, and neither of them said anything further about it. They made the corridor on day 3 as planned. It was the section Gideon had been thinking about most, the narrow mountain passage where the trail ran between the ridge wall and a long slope that fell away too sharply on the right side, a section that was fine for horses and mules, but required genuine attention with cattle because the animal's instinct in tight spaces was to bunch. And bunched cattle in a narrow mountain corridor was how you lost animals over a slope or started a panic that propagated backward through the whole herd. They went through it in the last hours of afternoon light, which wasn't ideal but was what they had. Gideon rode point with Lenora 20 yards behind him, the herd strung out long and single file through the tight section. Everyone quiet, everyone steady, the horses well behaved because the horses had been worked well for 6 weeks and trusted their riders in a way the previous Ironwood Crown horses hadn't trusted anyone. It was slow, it was tense. At one point, a young steer near the middle decided it had opinions about the pace and began the particular sideways shuffling that preceded a break, and Samuel Brandt appeared from nowhere behind it with a kind of quiet insistence that redirected the animal before the instinct became action. They came out the other side of the corridor with the full 212 head. Not a single loss. Nobody cheered. You didn't cheer on a cattle drive when something went right, because cattle drives had a way of hearing celebration and responding to it badly. But Gideon felt the collective exhale that went through the riders as the trail widened out into the eastern grade, and the worst of the terrain was behind them. Lenora pulled her horse up beside his. 2 days to Stonehaven, she said. Weather holds, he said. She looked at the sky. It'll hold. It didn't. Not entirely, but not badly enough to lose the drive. The storm that came through on the 4th night was the kind of fast-moving squall that dropped 6 inches in 3 hours and then moved east, leaving everything heavy and white and still. They'd made camp at the tree line where the coverage gave some protection, and by morning the trail ahead was thick but passable, and Eli Brandt, who apparently had opinions about weather that proved consistently accurate, said the sky had changed, and they'd have clear conditions the rest of the way. He was right. They were an hour outside Stonehaven when Fletcher, riding rear flank, came up at a quick trot that meant something had registered wrong. Gideon turned. Riders, Fletcher said, coming up from the south. 4 of them. They're not following the same trail we're on. They came from the valley road, but they're moving to intercept. Gideon looked at Lenora. She looked at him. Strake figured out the logging route, she said. Or figured out we were moving, he said. Doesn't matter which. They're here. He thought fast. How far from the Stonehaven gate? Hour, maybe less. Can we get there before they intercept? Fletcher looked back at the riders, calculating distance. Not if they push hard. They're on faster ground than we are. Then we don't run, Gideon said. We keep moving steady and we let them come to us. Panic the herd now and we lose everything. He looked at the Brandt brothers. Eli, Samuel. Keep the cattle moving. Don't speed up. Normal pace. What are you going to do? Lenora said. Talk to them, he said. Or not, depending on what they want. He dropped back to the position where the 4 riders would intersect the drive, placing himself between them and the herd. Lenora came with him, which he hadn't asked for and couldn't argue against, because arguing would take time they didn't have. The riders were Strake's men. He recognized one of them, the foreman, who'd come with the Before Dawn riders in Redwater, a lean, hard-faced man named Cutter, who had the particular quality of someone who'd been doing Strake's uncomfortable work for long enough that it no longer registered as uncomfortable. Cutter stopped his horse 20 feet away. The 3 men with him fanned out slightly, not threateningly exactly, but deliberately, the spacing of men who'd been told to create visual pressure. Miss Ashford, Cutter said. He barely glanced at Gideon. Mr. Strake asks that you reconsider your current direction. Tell Mr. Strake, Lenora said, that I'll reconsider my current direction when he reconsiders his business practices. There are buyers in Stonehaven who've been made aware of certain concerns about Ironwood Crown's reliability, Cutter said. You'll find the contract you're expecting has been made considerably less available. That's between me and the buyers, she said, not you. Miss Ashford. You're a capable woman running a difficult operation, and Mr. Strake respects that. He's offering a partnership that would guarantee you favorable pricing. He's offering control, she said, wrapped in polite language. The answer was no in October, and it's no now. Cutter looked at Gideon then, the first real look, and there was something in it that was not quite a threat, but was constructed to feel like one. You've made decisions about who to associate with that have put your operation at risk, he said to Lenora, but he was looking at Gideon. That's been noted. So has everything else, Gideon said quietly. Cutter's eyes sharpened slightly. Is that so? 3 years of weight discrepancies, Gideon said. 41 documented transactions. The total's written down, and it's going to Stonehaven with us. He kept his voice even, just laying information down the way you laid cards on a table. The buyers there might find it interesting. The territorial court system might find it more interesting. A silence, the kind that had weight. Cutter said nothing for a long moment. He was calculating. Gideon could see it, running the implications through a mind that was practical rather than panicked. What he was calculating was whether Gideon was bluffing. He wasn't bluffing. And something in his face communicated that clearly enough. We're going to Stonehaven, Lenora said. You can ride back and tell Mr. Strake that, or you can sit here in the snow. But we're going. She turned her horse and moved back toward the herd, without waiting for Cutter's response. Gideon held the position for one more moment, long enough to be clear that he was not retreating, then turned and followed. His hands were not entirely steady on the reins. He noticed that and didn't judge it. Confrontations with men who worked for powerful people who'd already shown they were willing to use serious leverage had a way of registering in the body even when the mind stayed level. He didn't look back to see if Cutter's men followed. Fletcher would tell him if they did. They didn't follow. Stonehaven appeared in the early afternoon of the 5th day, not a large town, but a real one, with the infrastructure of a genuine trading center and the particular energy of a place that handled commerce between multiple competing regions. They brought the cattle in through the south entrance, which Lenora had used before and knew the layout of, and by the time they'd gotten the herd settled in the sale yard, word had already moved ahead of them that Ironwood Crown had arrived. The Stonehaven buyers were 3 men who ran a purchasing cooperative, and they had indeed been contacted by someone representing Strake's interests. They'd been told about management instability at Ironwood Crown, about questionable personnel decisions, about the inadvisability of a long-term contract with an operation that was in transition. They said this to Lenora directly, which she appreciated because she'd expected them to be indirect about it, and indirect was harder to counter. She put Maisie's ledger on the table. She explained what it contained and how it had been compiled, and what the discrepancies meant when mapped against the Strake Yard's official records. She laid it out with the precision of someone who'd been preparing this specific argument for weeks, which she had, because the preparation had started the evening Maisie had produced that first sheet of paper with the numbers that didn't match. The buyers looked at the ledger for a long time. The senior buyer, a heavy-set man named Aldous Pryor, who had the intelligent eyes of someone who'd been cheated at least once and never forgotten what it felt like, looked up from the documents and said, "Where did you Get these records. They're mine, Lenora said. My copies of my own transactions compared against what Strake's yard recorded. The discrepancy total here is 3 years, she said. Just my operation. I have reason to believe other ranching families in the region have similar discrepancies in their records. Pryor looked at the ledger again. Then he looked at Gideon, who was standing slightly back from the table because this was Lenora's meeting and he was there for support, not to conduct it. You're the man from the Redwater cattle yard, Pryor said. The one who challenged Strake's numbers publicly. Yes, Gideon said. The same mechanism, yes. Different scale than what's documented in that ledger, but the same mechanism. Pryor set the ledger down. He looked at his two colleagues. A communication passed between them that didn't require words. Miss Ashford, Pryor said, what are your terms for a 3-year contract? The negotiation took 4 hours. It was not simple, and it was not entirely comfortable. Pryor was a thorough man who asked detailed questions and wasn't satisfied with general answers, which was actually what you wanted in a buyer you were going to trust for 3 years, but was also exhausting. Lenora answered every question. Gideon answered the operational ones she deferred to him. Fletcher stood near the back of the room and occasionally produced specific numbers from memory that turned out to be accurate too, within small margins. By the time it was done, the terms were better than Lenora had projected. Not dramatically better. Pryor wasn't the kind of man who gave away margin out of sentiment, but meaningfully better. The kind of better that would matter over 3 years, that would show up in numbers that ranching families in the region could point to and say, this is what's in independence from Strake's network actually looks like. She signed the contract in the late afternoon. Gideon watched her sign it. He watched her hand move across the paper, steady and certain, without the hesitation that big commitments sometimes put in people's hands. And he thought about the evening she'd shown him the map with the logging route marked on it in her father's old notation, and about Maisie handing her that first sheet of paper with the numbers that didn't match, and about the pump at the side of the barn that had been grinding wrong for 3 weeks before he'd heard it. He thought about how many things had to happen in a particular sequence to get from that gate in the snowstorm to this table in Stonehaven with a 3-year contract being signed. He thought about Caleb at the ranch right now, probably with the horses, probably doing something useful without being asked. He thought about Cutter's riders. He thought about Cutter's riders in the snow and the damaged receipt that would need to be found, and the territorial attorney that would need to be located, and all of the work that was still ahead. But right now, in this room, the contract was signed. Pryor shook Lenora's hand. Then he looked at Gideon and extended his hand to him as well, which Gideon hadn't expected. You started something in that cattle yard, Pryor said. I hope you have the stomach to finish it. Working on it, Gideon said. They prepared to ride back the next morning. The weather forecast from the locals was good, a wide, clear, window 3 days minimum, which was all they needed for the return. Gideon was doing the final check on the horses, before dawn when Lenora came out. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood near him in the cold while he worked through the check on each animal. Harold and Warren will be at the ranch when we get back, she said. Probably. Harold will have his organ concerns into a list. He does that. He'll present them formally, because he thinks formal presentation is harder to argue against. Is he wrong about that? Usually, she said. With most people. Not with me. She was quiet for a moment. I just need you to know that whatever Harold says about you or about the situation at the ranch, it doesn't. She stopped. Started again. I don't need you to defend yourself to Harold. I'll handle Harold. He finished checking the last horse and turned to look at her. In the pre-dawn light, her face was hard to read, but he'd spent enough weeks now learning the specific vocabulary of her expressions that he could make out what was underneath the careful neutral. She was asking him not to leave, not in those words. But that was what the speech was about. I'll be there, he said, for whatever comes next. She nodded once. They rode back the next morning into the cold white landscape, 5 riders and a cook's wagon and 212 head of cattle, the herd moving steadily on the return route, nobody speaking much, everyone tired in the particular satisfying way of people who'd done something difficult and brought it off mostly intact. The signed contract was in Lenora's saddlebag. Maisie's ledger was wrapped carefully in oilcloth inside his own pack. And somewhere behind them, 4 days south, Vernon Strake was either reading Cutter's report of the encounter in the snow, or he wasn't yet, but he would be soon, and when he read it, he would understand that the thing he'd tried to prevent had happened, and that the documentation riding back to Ironwood Crown was the beginning of a problem significantly larger than a widowed cowboy at a cattle yard gate. The mountain corridor was behind them. The sky was clear. The cattle moved on. Harold Ashford was exactly what Lenora had described, which somehow made him worse in person. He was a tall, his were dark. He was a tall man in his late 40s with the particular bearing of someone who had decided early in life that he was the most competent person in any room he entered and had spent the subsequent decades constructing a reality that supported that belief. He wore city clothes that were expensive enough to be noticed in ranch country, and had brought his wife, a quiet woman named Dorothea, who communicated primarily through small apologetic smiles directed at whoever Harold was currently addressing. Warren, the younger cousin, was broader and less defined. He had Harold's confidence on loan rather than by nature, and it showed in the way he positioned himself slightly behind Harold's shoulder in most conversations, available for reinforcement but not initiating. They'd been at Ironwood Crown for 2 days by the time the cattle drive returned. Gideon knew what 2 days of Harold Ashford in that house meant before he walked through the door, because he could read it in Maisie's face when she came running out to meet them. Maisie's face was an accurate emotional barometer. She didn't perform feelings. She just had them, visibly. And what her face said right now was that the past 2 days had been tense, and she was very glad they were back. The tall one talked about selling the ranch for an hour and a half yesterday, she said, falling into step beside Gideon as he led his horse toward the barn. Miss Ashford didn't say anything for most of it, and then she said one sentence, and he stopped talking. I didn't hear what she said, because she sent me out of the room first. Smart of her, Gideon said. Caleb told him you were the best horseman he'd ever seen, Maisie said. Harold made a face, also smart of Caleb. Harold asked me how long we'd been here, and I told him, and he did arithmetic in his head. I could see him doing it. Then he asked if my father was courting Miss Ashford. She looked up at Gideon with her direct eyes. I told him that was a personal question. Where did you learn that response? Miss Ashford, Maisie said. She told me this week that when someone asks a question it's none of their business, you don't have to say, it's none of their business, you just say it's personal, and let them feel awkward about it. Gideon stopped walking for a second. He looked at his 8-year-old daughter and had the complicated feeling of watching a child absorb something genuinely useful from someone who wasn't her parent. Go find Caleb, he said. Tell him to help Fletcher with the cattle count. Maisie went. Gideon took a breath and went to find Harold. Harold was in the office, not invited into it specifically, based on the way Lenora was standing near the desk with her arms at her sides, and her expression in the particular controlled stillness that he associated with her managing something that required more patience than she naturally had. The signed contract was on the stick between them. Harold was looking at it with the expression of a man who has received information that disrupts his narrative and is in the process of revising the narrative rather than the conclusion. Mr. Rourke, Harold said, when Gideon appeared in the doorway. Sees. He said it the way people said names when they were trying to establish that they knew exactly who you were and had already formed an opinion. Mr. Ashford, Gideon said, was just discussing with my cousin the wisdom of a 3-year contractual commitment during a period of operational uncertainty. The drive went well, Gideon said. 212 head, no losses. Contract signed at better terms than projected. I'm sure the drive was competently managed, Harold said, with the particular tone that meant he was granting competence in order to redirect to something he considered more important. My concern is less about the drive and more about the broader decision-making framework at this ranch. He looked at Lenora. You've made significant operational changes, hired personnel without consultation, committed to a long-term contract with buyer your family has no relationship with, and you're currently housing a man and his 2 children who arrived as strangers less than 2 months ago. I'm aware of what I've done, Lenora said. I was present for all of it. Lenora. Harold's voice shifted down into the register people used when they wanted to convey that they were being reasonable, and the other person was making that difficult. I'm not questioning your ability to run this ranch. I'm questioning the circumstances that have developed around it and the influence that may be operating in ways you're not fully seeing. Say it plainly, Lenora said. You've been circling it for 2 days. Just say it. Harold looked at Gideon, then at Lenora. I believe you've allowed a man with no stake in this property and no established history in the industry to insert themselves into a position of considerable influence over your decisions. I believe that man's presence here was enabled by a situation that, while sympathetic on its surface, may have been more deliberately constructed than it appeared. The room was quiet. Gideon said, "You think I manufactured the situation?" "I think a man who is skilled with people," Harold said carefully, "and who is motivated by circumstances, homelessness, unemployment, responsibility for 2 children, might find ways to make himself indispensable to a woman who is isolated, independent, and in possession of significant assets." It was, Gideon noted, a coherent theory. Wrong in every factual detail, but coherent in structure. The kind of case that sounded reasonable to people who hadn't been there and wanted a simple explanation for a complicated situation. "Harold," Lenora said, and her voice had changed, not louder, quieter, in the specific way that preceded something definitive. "I'm going to say this once. Gideon Rourke fixed a pump on his first morning here without being asked and without telling me until I found him doing it. He identified and corrected 6 weeks of deferred maintenance that your reliable information about this apparently never mentioned. He helped me put together a cattle drive that secured a contract that guarantees Ironwood Crown's independent income for 3 years. And he told me within the first week that Strake's people would use his presence here against me, and he offered to leave so I wouldn't have to deal with it." She looked at Harold steadily. "I told him to stay. That was my decision, made with complete information. If you have a concern about my judgment, address it to me, not to my motivations for trusting someone who has consistently earned that trust." Harold opened his mouth, closed it. Warren, from his position near the window, looked at the floor. Harold tried again. "The community perception." "The community perception," Lenora said, "is being managed by Vernon Strake, who started those rumors specifically to undermine my operation before I could get to Stonehaven, which I did, with a signed contract and documentation of 3 years of systematic fraud that I intend to take to a territorial attorney." She picked up the signed contract from the desk and held it out to Harold. "Read the terms. Then tell me whether my judgment is the problem here." Harold took the contract. He read it. It took about 4 minutes, which was the appropriate amount of time for a thorough reading, and during those minutes the room was very quiet, and Gideon stood in the doorway and Lenora stood by the desks, and Warren looked at the window as though it contained something deeply interesting. Harold set the contract down. His expression had changed in a way he wasn't fully controlling. The revision was visible, the narrative adjusting, not because Harold was capable of genuine reconsidering quickly, but because the numbers were there and the numbers were incontrovertible. And Harold did, as Lenora had said, speak the language of numbers. "The fraud documentation," Harold said finally. "How solid is it?" 41 transactions, 3 years. "My copies compared against yard records," Lenora said. "My 8-year-old assembled the comparison ledger. I'll put it against any accountant you want to bring in." Another silence. "I'll want to see that documentation," Harold said. "I expected you would," Lenora said. "Maisie can walk you through it. She knows every entry." Harold looked slightly pained at the idea of having financial documentation explained to him by an 8-year-old, which was, Gideon suspected, part of why Lenora had framed it that way. The cousins left 2 days later. Harold shook Gideon's hand before he went, a brief handshake with nothing warm in it, but nothing hostile either. The handshake of a man who had revised his narrative and was not yet comfortable with the revision. Warren shook his hand with more genuine neutrality and said quietly, "You did right by her on that drive." Then he went after Harold. Lenora watched their wagon go down the lane from the porch. She said nothing until it was out of sight. "He'll come back," she said. "Probably," Gideon said, "but not with the same argument." She turned and went back inside. The attorney came 3 weeks later. His name was Silas Pembroke, and he had been described to them by Aldous Pryor in Stonehaven as a man who was thorough, expensive, and constitutionally incapable of being intimidated by money or reputation, which were exactly the qualities the situation required. He arrived on a Wednesday morning in a good coat and bad boots, the boots of a man who spent most of his life indoors and had underestimated Montana in winter, and he sat at the kitchen table for 6 hours on his first day and read every document. Most of its windows were dark. Maisie had organized with the focused attention of someone who billed by the hour and wanted to understand what he was billing for. At the end of the 6 hours, he looked up and said, "This is enough to open an investigation. It is not yet enough to guarantee a conviction. What I need are corroborating records from other ranchers who've gone through Strake's yard." "How many?" Lenora asked. "Minimum 3 independent parties with documentable discrepancies. More is better. The pattern is what matters. One rancher's complaint is a dispute. 5 ranchers' complaints is fraud." "Abel Mercer," Gideon said immediately. "He has his own records. He's the man I challenged Strake over at the cattle yard." "I'll need to talk to him," Pembroke said. "He'll be cautious," Gideon said. "He's been afraid of Strake since the yard incident. But he kept his records because he didn't quite trust the numbers even before that day. I think if he understood there were others coming forward, that's how it works," Pembroke said. "One person willing to speak makes it easier for the next. The ones who've been isolated break down when they realize they weren't alone." Getting to Abel Mercer required a conversation Gideon had been both preparing for and dreading, because Abel was a man who'd spent 3 months living with the knowledge that a public confrontation on his behalf had resulted in a father and his 2 children being driven out of Redwater in a snowstorm. The guilt of that, Gideon suspected, had been sitting on Abel's shoulders since November, and men who carry guilt like that sometimes closed themselves off, rather than reopen something that had already cost someone else. He rode to Mercer's place alone. He didn't take Lenora, not because her presence would have been unwelcome, but because this was a conversation between 2 men who shared a specific history, and the particular honesty it required was easier without witnesses. Abel was in his barn when Gideon arrived. He came out, saw who was dismounting, and went still for a moment in the way of someone who has been expecting something and isn't sure whether the expectation is better or worse than the actual arrival. "You look like you ate regular this winter," Abel said finally. "Found work," Gideon said. "Ironwood Crown, heard something like that." Abel looked at him carefully. "Heard other things too. The rumors Strake's men started, among others." Abel studied him. "You doing all right? Your kids?" "Better than I had any right to expect," Gideon said honestly. "Abel, I need to talk to you about your records." Abel was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the barn, then at the sky, then at Gideon. "Come inside," he said. The inside of Abel Mercer's house had the particular quality of a space maintained by someone who lived alone and maintained things out of habit rather than hope. It was clean in the practical sense, and empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. Abel made coffee without asking, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Gideon explained about Pembroke and the 41 documented transactions and the Stonehaven contract, and what the attorney had said about corroborating records. Abel listened without interrupting. When Gideon finished, Abel got up and went to a cupboard and came back with a ledger that was older than Maisie's organized version, but had the same essential quality, a record of transactions, compared against what had actually happened, maintained by a man who'd known something was wrong, but hadn't had a structure or a reason to use it. 23 years, Abel said, setting it on the table. "I've been running cattle through Strake's yard for 23 years. He opened it to a page marked with a piece of string. "I started keeping the comparison records about 6 years ago, when the numbers started feeling off. I thought maybe I was wrong. I'm not." He stopped. "I was never good at arithmetic the way you are. I thought maybe I was miscounting on my end." "You weren't miscounting," Gideon said. "No," Abel said, "I wasn't." He looked at the ledger. "How many families are we talking about, if this goes to court?" "Pembroke thinks potentially 3 dozen, maybe more." Abel sat with that for a moment. 3 dozen ranching families in the region, each carrying some version of what was in his own ledger, the quiet subtraction, year after year, small enough per transaction to be arguable, large enough across a decade to represent the difference between a ranch that was growing and a ranch that was slowly bleeding out. "He'll fight it," Abel said. "Strake has connections in the territorial government. He's been cultivating them for years." "Pembroke knows that," Gideon said. He says, "The pattern of evidence is the counter to the connections. Connections protect individual complaints. They don't hold against a systematic documented case involving 3 dozen families." "You sound like you believe that." "I believe Pembroke believes it," Gideon said. "And I believe Lenora Ashford is not going to stop until this goes somewhere, regardless of how long it takes." Abel looked at him for a moment with an expression that had something in it that Gideon recognized as the particular form of relief that came when someone else articulated what you'd been carrying alone. "All right," Abel said. He closed the ledger and slid it across the table toward Gideon. "All right." The evidence gathering took the better part of 2 months, and it was not clean work. Pembroke was thorough, in the way good attorneys were thorough. He followed every thread regardless of where it led, including threads that complicated the case rather than simplified it. 3 ranchers they'd been counting on turned out to have records too incomplete to be useful. 2 others, who'd seemed reluctant initially, came forward with documentation that was better than anyone had expected. A former employee of Strake's weighing operation, a man named Collier, who'd left the yard under unclear circumstances 4 years ago, reached out to Pembroke through a mutual contact with information about the internal mechanics of the fraud. Collier was the pivot point, not because his information was the most dramatic it wasn't, but because he was the only person who had been inside the operation and seen how it worked from that side. He was nervous in the way of someone who'd been complicit in something and had been rationalizing it for years, and was now being asked to stop rationalizing, and the nervousness made him difficult to work with, and absolutely credible on paper, which was the combination that mattered. He knew about the gorge. That was how Gideon found out. Collier mentioned it to Pembroke in what he thought was a separate context, a story about something he'd heard from another of Strake's men, a drinking night confession that he'd filed away and never done anything with because he hadn't had a reason to. He hadn't connected it to the cattle drive. Pembroke came to find Gideon on a Thursday evening in February, 2 months after the Stonehaven drive, and laid out what Collier had said with the measured precision of a man who understood the weight of what he was delivering. Strake knew about the logging route, Pembroke said. Not in advance. Cutter worked it out after the drive was already moving. Strake sent men ahead on a parallel track to get past you. We encountered Cutter's riders, Gideon said. They intercepted us an hour out of Stonehaven. That was Cutter's group. There was a second group. Pembroke paused. Collier says he heard from one of them afterward. They went ahead of the drive through the corridor and installed wire fencing at the gorge section. Gideon stopped. He thought about the corridor, about the narrow passage between the ridge wall and the slope, about the cattle coming through in the late afternoon, strung out long in single file, the gorge section 100 yards past the exit point where the trail widened. They'd come through the corridor after dark would have been worse. They'd come through in the last light. We didn't go through the gorge section, he said. No, Pembroke said. You took the ridge exit above it. Collier says the men who installed the fencing didn't know the trail well enough to anticipate you'd use that exit instead of the standard lower path. We used the ridge exit because the standard lower path had erosion damage, Gideon said. He heard his own voice from a distance slightly. Lenora knew the terrain. She directed us to the upper exit. Yes, Pembroke said. The thing about understanding a near disaster after the fact was that it didn't have the sharp edge of the moment itself. It came in slower, settled into a different place. The place of its windows were dark, where you put the things that had been possible rather than the things that happened. He thought about Lenora's voice in the corridor, steady, directing them upward. He thought about the cattle's were dark. He thought about the cattle moving through. He thought about what the lower path with fresh fencing, in the last light, with a moving herd, would have looked like. The fencing materials, he said. Is there evidence of where they came from? Collier says the crew used materials from a Strake supplier. He thinks there would be a purchase record. He's not certain. Pembroke looked at him steadily. This is the part that changes things, Mr. Rourke. This is not just fraud. If we can document that fencing was installed at that location with the intention of disrupting the drive, we're looking at deliberate endangerment. He tried to destroy the herd, Gideon said. At minimum, Pembroke said, at minimum, that was the intent. Gideon thought about Lenora's face when she signed the contract. He thought about what would have happened if they'd taken the lower path. He thought about Cutter in the snow, 4 of them fanned out, and the calculation he'd seen Cutter running when Gideon said the ledger was going to Stonehaven. Strake hadn't been trying to stop a contract. He'd been trying to stop a herd, stop it badly enough, visibly enough, that the operation looked unstable, and the documentation went with the cattle over the edge. We need to find that purchase record, Gideon said. We do, Pembroke said. I have a contact at the supplier Collier named. It's going to take some careful handling. How long? Weeks, maybe longer. And I need to warn you, when this moves into formal investigation territories, Strake will know. He has enough connections to get information from the court apparatus before we'd like him to have it. When he knows, the pressure will increase. On Lenora, on everyone associated with this, Pembroke said, including you. Gideon thought about that for a moment. About the children. About Maisie's organized ledgers. About Caleb, who'd been spending every hour with the horses and had developed, in the past 3 months, the particular quiet confidence of a boy who'd found something he was genuinely good at. Do what you need to do, he said. We'll handle the pressure. He was overconfident about that, and the evidence arrived about 6 weeks later in a form he hadn't anticipated. Caleb followed the second drive. That was what happened. The second drive, a smaller one. 40 head to a regional buyer, 60 miles north, went out in early March, and Caleb, who had been told in clear terms that he was too young to ride with the crew, who had agreed without visible argument, and had therefore been trusted to stay at the ranch, had decided that agreement and compliance were different things, and had packed 2 days of food, and followed the drive at a distance for the first day before the weather changed. The weather changed badly. Not catastrophically, it wasn't a blizzard. It was a fast-moving ice storm that dropped temperatures 30 degrees in 4 hours and turned the trail surface into something closer to glass than dirt. The drive crew made camp at the first defensible position and waited it out. Caleb, riding alone on a borrowed horse that was too big for him, on a trail section that had become treacherous, in a temperature that was dropping past the range where being caught in the open stopped being uncomfortable and started being dangerous, had taken shelter in a stand of timber on the slope above the trail. He'd found the shelter. That was the thing Gideon had to hold on to in the days that followed. Caleb had made the right call, had read the danger, and gotten himself under cover rather than pushing forward. But the Tuvit's windows were dark. But the timber on that slope was old growth that had been weakened by the previous months of variable weather, and the ice weight that accumulated during the storm had brought a section of it down, and Caleb had been at the wrong edge of the right shelter when it came. Fletcher found him. Fletcher had gone back along the trail when the storm broke to look for track evidence of whether anyone had followed the drive. Gideon had a habit which he'd shared with Fletcher of always checking back after weather events to see what the trail told you. Fletcher found Caleb's horse first, standing ground-tied in the way Gideon had taught Caleb to tie a horse, patient and cold, but uninjured. He found Caleb 20 yards into the timber, pinned at the leg by a fallen section of trunk that was 4 feet in diameter, and old enough that its weight was something closer to stone than wood. Caleb was conscious. His leg was not broken. The tree had pinned it against a natural rock shelf that had taken some of the crush weight. Most of its windows were dark, but he was cold past the point where cold was just uncomfortable, and he'd been there for several hours, and the position of the timber meant that Fletcher alone could not move it. Fletcher rode back to camp at the speed of a man who understood that speed was the only useful thing he had to offer. Gideon was on a horse inside of 3 minutes. He didn't think on the ride back along the trail. He was aware of thinking, happening, processing, calculating, the distance to the timber stand, what equipment they had, how long Caleb had been pinned, what that meant for the leg and the cold, but it wasn't the kind of thinking that left room for anything else. And he was grateful for that, because the alternative was the kind of feeling that would have slowed him down, and he couldn't afford to be slowed down. Lenora came behind him. He hadn't asked her to. He heard her horse on the trail and looked back once and saw her, and then they were both riding, and there wasn't time for conversation. The timber stand looked wrong in the way that disaster sites looked wrong. Too quiet, too still, the ordinary landscape disrupted by something that shouldn't be there. The horse was standing where Fletcher had left it. The down section was immediately visible. A huge pale break in the standing timber, the fresh wood smell of it still sharp in the cold air. Caleb was there. His face was white, and his jaw was set in the particular way Gideon recognized as his son's version of not letting himself panic, and the sight of it, that 12-year-old jaw, set and deliberate. Doing the work of managing fear went through Gideon with a force he absorbed and put aside because he didn't have time for it. "Hey, Pa," Caleb said. His voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "Hey," Gideon said. He was already at the timber, hands on it, running the physics through his head. The trunk was too large to lift directly. The angle of the pinning was against them. The tree had fallen along the slope in a way that put the full weight against the downhill side, which was where Caleb's leg was. Moving it required lifting and rotating simultaneously, which required either more hands than they had, or a mechanical advantage. Rope, Lenora said behind him. She had a coil off her saddle already. If we anchor to her, she indicated her horse, who was a large, well-built animal that had been pulling things for years and had the physical capability the moment required, and run it through that fork to change the angle. He looked at the fork she was pointing to. A standing tree 15 feet away with a natural branch fork at the right height. The rope through the fork would redirect the pull and give them the rotation they needed. Yes, he said. Yes. I'll get underneath. I can get enough leverage on the uphill side to assist the rotation if the rope is doing the directional work. That's dangerous, she said. Less dangerous than leaving it. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she started running the rope. What followed was not smooth. It was not the kind of thing that went according to plan and worked the first time. The rope slipped on the first attempt, and they had to reset it. Gideon's position under the trunk, working with his back and shoulders against the uphill side, was cramped and wrong in ways that cost him real effort, the bark grinding into his shoulders, the weight of the thing, pressing down even on the uphill face, in a way that made the physics feel impossible, even as he knew they weren't. Caleb, to his enduring credit, held completely still and kept his breathing deliberate, which was the one thing that made everything else workable. A panicking child in that position would have made the extraction impossible. The horse pulled on Lenora's signal. The rope ran through the fork and changed the angle. Gideon pushed from underneath. The timber shifted not easily, not cleanly, but it shifted, rotating 3 inches, then 5. And then Lenora was calling out, and Fletcher had moved to Caleb's side and was pulling him clear with the particular urgent gentleness of someone who understood that speed and care were not opposites. Caleb came free. The timber settled back a second later with a sound that was large and definitive, and Gideon pulled himself out from under the uphill side on hands and knees in the snow and turned to look at his son and registered that Caleb was upright, leaning on Fletcher, standing on both legs, though not comfortably on the pinned one. He crossed the distance and put his hands on Caleb's face, checking the way you checked when what you'd been afraid of was specific and had a specific face. Caleb looked at him with the expression of a 12-year-old boy who knows he has done something seriously wrong and is also very glad his father is there. I wanted to see the drive, Caleb said. I know, Gideon said. I know I shouldn't have. We're going to talk about that, Gideon said. Not right now, is my leg. You're standing on it. That's a good sign. He stepped back and looked at Caleb's leg properly, ran his hands along it, watched for the reactions. Nothing that suggested a break. Deep bruising, swelling already starting, possibly something pulled in the knee that would need watching. Can you ride? Yes, Caleb said with more certainty than accuracy. Tell me honestly, a pause probably, if someone leads the horse. Fletcher will lead you back. Most of it were dark. Then Lenora was there on Caleb's other side, and she put her hand briefly on the back of his neck, in the way an adult did when a child had been frightened. And you wanted to communicate without words that they were all right, and you were glad. It was a small gesture. It lasted about 2 seconds. Caleb leaned into it slightly, without seeming to notice that he was doing it, the way children leaned into comfort when they'd been scared enough that their defenses were down. Gideon noticed. He noticed, and he put it away in the same place. He'd been putting things for 3 months, the place that was getting crowded. On the ride back to camp, with Fletcher leading Caleb's horse and Lenora riding beside Gideon, she said quietly, "He's going to be fine." "I know," Gideon said. "But you didn't know that for about 30 minutes back there." "No," he said. "I didn't." She didn't say anything else for a while. Then she said, "You went under that timber without thinking twice." "I thought twice," he said. It still came out the same way. Another silence. "I didn't do it alone," he said. She looked at him, then looked back at the trail ahead. "No," she said. "You didn't." The leg kept Caleb off horses for 3 weeks, which was a punishment he felt more keenly than anything Gideon might have designed deliberately. They had their reckoning when Caleb could sit at the kitchen table without his leg, elevated a real conversation, not a lecture, about decisions and consequences, and the specific mechanics of how one person's impulse could put other people in danger. Caleb took it straight, the way he took most things, without flinching and without making excuses, which was simultaneously the thing Gideon was most proud of and the thing that made the conversation hardest. I know you wanted to go, Gideon said. I really wanted to go, Caleb said. I know. And next year, maybe you will. If you do the things between now and then that tell me you understand what happened out there. He looked at his son. Can you tell me what happened out there? Caleb thought about it seriously. I put myself in a dangerous situation because I wanted something, he said slowly. And then other people had to go into dangerous situations because of what I'd done. Fletcher, you Miss Ashford. He looked at his hands. If the rope had slipped again, but it didn't, Gideon said. It could have. Yes, Gideon said. It could have. Caleb was quiet for a moment. She didn't have to come, he said. Miss Ashford.
That wasn't her job.
No, Gideon said. It wasn't. But she came right away, she did. Caleb looked at him with his two old eyes. Pa, he said. Are we still pretending? Gideon looked at his son. Pretending what, he said, though he knew. That this is temporary, Caleb said. That we're still figuring out where we go next. That this is just a job. He said it without accusation. Just laying it down, the way he laid most things down plainly, because he'd decided that plainness was more efficient than circling. The kitchen was quiet around them. The afternoon light came through the window at the angle it came through in March. Low and long, the particular light of a season just beginning to consider changing. Gideon thought about the pump, the fence, the ledger, Cutter in the snow, the timber in the stand, and the rope through the fork, and Caleb coming clear. He thought about a lamp moving in a window in a snowstorm, and boots on wood flooring, and a woman standing at a porch railing, asking who was out there. No, he said finally, we're not pretending. Caleb nodded, slow and certain, like a man accepting something he'd already known for a while. Outside, the March wind was doing something different than the November wind had done, less like weather that wanted to get through you, and more like weather that was moving on. The gate at the end of the lane was visible from the kitchen window, iron and solid, and beyond it the lane ran straight up to the house where the lamp would be lit when evening came. Gideon sat with his son at the kitchen table in the afternoon light and let the truth of where they were settle completely for the first time. This was not a place they were passing through. The purchase record existed. Pembroke found it in the third week of April, through his contact at the supply company, a legitimate hardware merchant in a town 40 miles south of Redwater who had sold fencing materials on a specific date in late November, charged to an account that traced back through two intermediary names before landing, unambiguously, on a purchasing arrangement that Strake's operation used for supply, runs it preferred not to put under the main business ledger. The merchant hadn't known what the materials were for. He'd kept the record because he kept all his records, the way honest businessmen did. Because honest understood that paperwork was the only thing standing between them and someone else's version of events. Pembroke brought the document to Ironwood Crown on a Tuesday and laid it on the kitchen table next to Maisie's ledger and Abel Mercer's comparison records and the statements from 4 other ranching families that had come in over the previous 6 weeks, and he looked at the assembled collection for a moment, with the expression of a man who has been doing difficult work for a long time and occasionally allows himself to register when that work has produced something real. This is enough, he said, not for everything, not yet, but enough to open formal proceedings. Enough that when I walk into the territorial court with this, a judge is going to read it and take it seriously. Lenora looked at the table, at the documents laid out across it, months of careful work made visible. What happens to Strake when you file? He gets notified, Pembroke said. That's unavoidable. He'll have his own attorneys inside 24 hours of notification, and they'll be good ones. He's been preparing for legal challenge since the Stonehaven Drive Cutters report would have told him the documentation existed. He paused. He'll also move to protect his assets immediately. There's a window after filing where things will be active and unresolved, and during that window he's going to be looking for ways to discredit the case. Us, Gideon said. The witnesses, Pembroke said carefully. Abel Mercer, in particular, and Collier. He looked at Gideon directly. And you. Your public challenge at the cattle yard is the inciting incident of this entire case. Any defense attorney worth the fee is going to try to characterize that moment as a grievance rather than an observation personal animosity, a disgruntled laborer looking for leverage. I wasn't a laborer, Gideon said. I was looking for work. I hadn't been hired. I know that, Pembroke said. Making a court understand the distinction is what I do. I'm telling you because you should know the shape of the argument coming at you, not because I think it'll succeed. He gathered the documents with the particular care of a man for whom paper was a form of currency. File next week. Be ready for things to move quickly after that. Things moved quickly. The filing happened on a Wednesday. By Friday, Strake's attorneys had responded with a counter-filing that characterized the case as a coordinated harassment campaign orchestrated by a rival commercial interest, meaning Lenora against an established businessman, using manufactured records and the testimony of disgruntled former associates. It was, Pembroke said when he sent word of it, exactly the response he'd expected, and exactly the response that told you the other side was worried, because attorneys who weren't worried filed quieter responses. The pressure that followed was not the kind that announced itself. It was the kind Gideon already knew. The accumulated small weight of things going wrong in ways that were individually explainable and collectively deliberate. A supply order Lenora had placed in February went missing at the merchant end and had to be replaced at a higher cost. A ranching family named Whitfield, who had been the fifth party to provide corroborating records, received a visit from men who identified themselves as representing a land survey company and spent 3 hours asking questions about property boundaries that had the effect of making the Whitfields very anxious about a completely unrelated legal matter. Most of its windows were dark. 3 of his cattle dead on a Monday morning with no clear cause. The local ranchers all understood what it meant, and Abel understood what it meant. And he came to Gideon and said, with the quiet fury of a man who has been patient for too long, I am not withdrawing my statement, before Gideon had even asked. That was the thing about what Strake was doing that he hadn't calculated correctly. He'd built his operation on isolation, on keeping each ranching family alone with their individual complaint, unable to compare notes, unable to see the pattern.
The moment that isolation broke.
The moment people started talking to each other and discovering that what had happened to them had happened to everyone, the pressure tactics so stopped working the way they were designed to work. Because pressure on isolated people created fear. Pressure on people who knew they weren't alone created something else. It created anger. It created the particular anger of people who realized they'd been managed for years by someone who'd been counting on them not to talk to each other, and who were now talking to each other constantly, and who found that the experience of comparison, your story against my story, against her story, was both enraging and fortifying in equal measure. Lenora hosted a gathering at Ironwood Crown in late April. Not a formal meeting, she was careful not to call it that, because formal meetings in a legal context had implications she didn't want, but a Sunday afternoon where ranching families who were part of the case or adjacent to it came to the ranch, ate together, and talked in the way that people talked when they'd been kept from talking for too long. 31 families. Some of them hadn't been to each other's places in years. Some had relationships frayed by the competitive pressure of working in Strake's network, where your neighbor's gain sometimes felt like your loss, because Strake had constructed it that way, had kept everyone slightly hungry and slightly uncertain, so they never quite had enough surplus to feel generous toward each other. Gideon watched it from the porch for most of the afternoon. He wasn't the host. This was Lenora's gathering on her land, for a cause that was hers as much as anyone's. He worked the practical side of it, made sure there was enough food and enough space, and that the horses were handled correctly. And he watched 31 families remember that they were neighbors. Maisie was in the middle of it, within 20 minutes, having apparently decided that no gathering of adults was complete, without an 8-year-old asking direct questions. He saw her talking to Abel Mercer's wife, a small woman named Ruth, who'd said almost nothing at the few previous interactions, and who was, under Maisie's particular brand of focused interest, saying quite a lot about the past 20 years. Caleb was with the horses. He was always with the horses now, with a competence that had moved past apprentice and into something more serious, a genuine feel for the animals that couldn't be taught directly. The kind of thing you either had or didn't, and Caleb had it in the way his mother had it, which was not something Gideon let himself think about directly very often, because thinking about it directly still cost him something. Fletcher came to stand beside him on the porch. 17 of them told me they'd been thinking about going independent before this, Fletcher said. Going to Stonehaven or other buyers. But nobody wanted to be first. Nobody wants to be first, Gideon said. That's how it always works. You were first, Fletcher said. It wasn't accusatory, just accurate. I was first in a cattle yard, and it cost me everything I had, Gideon said. Being first is expensive. Looks like it's paying out now. Gideon looked at the yard full of families who were beginning to understand that they had more in common with each other than they'd been allowed to believe. Slowly, he said. The hearing was in June. It was held in the territorial court in a town called Carver Falls, a 3-day ride from Ironwood Crown, and it was not a single dramatic day, but a series of sessions over 2 weeks, which was how legal proceedings actually worked, not the clean confrontation of a story, but the grinding, methodical accumulation of evidence and testimony and counter-argument and objection and evidence again. Pembroke had told them this, but knowing it in advance didn't make sitting through it easier. Strake appeared on the first day with 3 attorneys and the particular aura of a man who had been through adversarial proceedings before and understood that the performance of confidence was itself a legal strategy. He was dressed well. He sat straight. He looked to the unfamiliar eye, like exactly what his attorneys would argue he was, a successful businessman being persecuted by aggrieved parties who'd constructed a false narrative around legitimate commercial practices. Gideon saw him clearly for the first time since the cattle yard. He'd been expecting some internal response to seeing the man who'd destroyed his situation in Redwater, who'd sent riders before dawn, who'd installed wire fencing on a mountain trail to scatter a herd that happened to be carrying Lenora's future. He wasn't sure what he expected. Rage, maybe. Or the cold version of it that he was better at managing. What he felt, looking at Strake across a courtroom, was mostly tired. Not defeated, tired. The tired of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and was close enough to putting it down that the weight was particularly noticeable. Strake looked at him once during the opening session. The same 2-second look as the cattle yard. The same temperature drop quality. Then Strake looked away, which was to tell the man who'd had him run out of Redwater with 2 children and a snowstorm was now looking away, because the calculus had changed and Strake's eyes knew it, even if the rest of him wasn't ready to acknowledge it. Abel Mercer testified on the 4th day. He was not a polished witness. He spoke slowly, sometimes repeated himself, occasionally lost the thread of a question and had to be redirected. Strake's attorney worked hard on him, using the techniques designed to make an elderly man seem confused or unreliable, asking rapid questions, challenging specific dates, pointing out that memories of 23 years of transactions were inherently imprecise. Abel sat through all of it with the dignity of someone who'd made a decision and intended to honor it regardless of how uncomfortable the honoring got. When the attorney finished, he looked at the judge and said, unprompted, I've kept those records for 6 years because I knew something was wrong and I didn't know what to do about it. I'm glad I kept them. Strake's attorney objected to the comment as non-responsive. The judge allowed it to stand. Collier testified on the 7th day. He was the worst witness in the conventional sense, nervous, inconsistent on minor details, visibly uncomfortable with the position he'd put himself in, and the best witness in the actual sense. Because the nervousness read as genuine, which it was, and the things he was certain about, he was very certain about, and no amount of cross-examination moved him off the specific facts, the conversation he'd overheard, the names mentioned, the materials, and the location, and the date. Strake's attorney called him a disgruntled former employee, seeking attention and financial benefit. Collier looked at the attorney and said, I left that job because I knew what the materials were being used for after the fact, and I couldn't make myself go back. He paused. I should have said something sooner. Nobody in the room missed it. Gideon testified on the 9th day. He told the story of the cattle yard from the beginning, what he'd observed, how he'd observed it, what he'd said, what had happened afterward. Strake's attorney tried the disgruntled laborer angle that Pembroke had predicted, suggesting that Gideon's public challenge had been motivated by personal grievance rather than honest observation. Gideon said, I wasn't employed there. I'd come looking for work. I had no grievance against Mr. Strake. I'd never met him before that morning. You'd been unable to find work in Redwater for some time before that morning, the attorney said. Well, I'd been in Redwater for 14 months and had steady work until that morning, Gideon said. I had no work after it, because of your behavior at the cattle yard. Because Mr. Strake removed it, Gideon said, which is part of why we're here. Pembroke let that land before his redirect, which was the right call. The hardware merchant testified on the 11th day. He brought his original ledger, the physical book, and identified the entry and the account number and the date with the particular calm of a man for whom records were not negotiable. He hadn't known what the fencing was for, he said. He'd sold fencing materials to that account before without incident. He'd kept the record because he kept all his records. Strake's attorney argued the account connection was tenuous, a secondary purchasing arrangement that didn't directly implicate Strake's personal direction. Pembroke produced a document showing that the account in question had been used for 4 previous transactions that were directly tied to Strake's operational decisions. The attorney objected. The judge looked at the document for a long time. The proceedings concluded on the 14th day. The judge did not rule immediately. These things didn't work that way. And the 2 weeks of waiting that followed were, in some respects, harder than the proceedings themselves, because proceedings had structure and waiting had nothing but itself. Lenora managed the waiting by working, which was her habitual response to things she couldn't control, and Gideon managed it by working alongside her, which had become his habitual response to most things over the past 7 months. The ruling came on a Thursday in late July. It was long. Legal rulings were always long, full of language designed to be precise rather than readable. But the substance of it came through clearly enough. The evidence presented established a pattern of systematic fraudulent wait recording across multiple transactions with multiple parties over an extended period. The hardware merchant's records, corroborated by Collier's testimony, and the account documentation Pembroke had produced, established a credible connection between Strake's operation and the installation of materials at the mountain location in a manner consistent with deliberate interference with a lawful cattle drive. Strake was ordered to make restitution to 31 named parties, the amount calculated from the documented discrepancies with interest. His commercial licenses were suspended pending further review. The question of criminal charges for the mountain interference was referred to a separate proceeding. 31 families. Gideon read the list of names in Pembroke's summary letter and thought about those families at Ironwood Crown in April, the Sunday afternoon gathering, the way they'd talked to each other after years of being kept separate. He thought about the particular thing that happened. What happened when people who'd been isolated discovered they weren't alone, how the anger of it was real, but underneath the anger was something else. Something that didn't have a clean name, but felt like the recovery of something that should never have been taken. The news traveled faster than the formal documents. By Friday morning, ranching families across the region knew the outcome. By Saturday, Strake's commercial buyers had started the process of reviewing their own arrangements because buyers were practical people and a supplier facing fraud findings and license suspension was a liability rather than an asset. Strake's network didn't collapse in a single moment. It came apart the way things built on concealment came apart not dramatically but thoroughly. One connection at a time, each withdrawal triggering the next. The whole structure revealing how much of its apparent solidity had depended on the cooperation of people who'd been cooperating out of necessity rather than loyalty. When the necessity ended, the loyalty turned out to have never been there. By autumn, Strake was gone from the territory. Not fled, he'd stayed through the cruisings and the early aftermath with the composure of a man who believed his attorneys could find a working angle through everything. But the restitution amounts, combined with the commercial collapse, made his position in the territory untenable in the specific financial sense. Vernereich was ultimately a man who lived by financial calculation, and the calculation told him there was nothing left worth protecting here. He sold what could be sold, liquidated what couldn't, and left without making a statement which was perhaps the most accurate summary of who he was, a man who arrived in a place, extracted what he could, and departed when the extraction was finished. Gideon heard about the departure from Fletcher, who heard it from Arvid, who'd watched Strake's wagon, Strake's leave Redwater early on a September morning, with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd been afraid of something for a long time, and was watching that something drive away. He told Lenora over breakfast. She put down her coffee cup. She was quiet for a moment, the processing quiet that he knew well by now. Good, she said finally. Just the one word. He understood everything in it. Most of its windows were dark. Abel Mercer came to Ironwood Crown the week after the restitution payments cleared, carrying a bottle of whiskey he said he'd been saving for something worth celebrating, and they sat on the porch in the September evening, and Gideon poured 2 glasses, and they didn't talk much about what had happened, but sat with it in the comfortable way of people who'd shared something difficult and came out the other side intact, which was its own kind of conversation. "My grandson's going to take over the operation," Abel said, after a while. "He's been wanting to, and now I've got enough to modernize some things that needed it for years." He looked at his glass. Wouldn't have had enough before. The restitution. 7 years of it all at once. He shook his head slowly. 7 years. I kept telling myself the numbers were close enough, that I was probably miscounting somewhere, that a man like Strake wouldn't bother with the small amounts he was taking from someone like me. He was quiet for a moment. That was the thing about it. He made each family feel too small to be worth cheating. Like your account wasn't big enough to bother with real fraud. But that was the whole mechanism, everybody feeling too small to fight. So nobody fought. "Until someone did," Gideon said. "Until someone did," Abel agreed. He looked at Gideon sideways. "Was it worth it? What it cost you in Redwater?" Gideon thought about it honestly, because Abel deserved honest, and because the question was real. 14 months of building something in Redwater, gone in a morning because he'd said what he saw. His children in a wagon in a snowstorm. $4.20. The particular cold of that early morning on the drive northwest, with Caleb's jaw set and Maisie coughing in the back of the wagon. He looked at the ranch house behind him, where the lamp was already lit in the kitchen window, and where, if he listened, he could hear Maisie's voice explaining something to Lenora, with the particular enthusiasm she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. "Yes," he said, "it was worth it." Abel looked at the evening sky, the September light going long and gold over the pastures. "I thought you were a fool," he said. "That morning at the cattle yard. I thought you were a young fool who was going to get himself hurt over something that wasn't his business." "I was probably a fool," Gideon said. "The outcome being good doesn't necessarily mean the decision was wise." "But you'd make it again," Abel said, in that same moment. "Yes," Gideon said. "I've thought about it enough times to know the answer doesn't change. I can't watch something wrong happen and let it go. That's not about being brave. It's more like I can't do it. The mechanism that would let me do it isn't there." Abel nodded slowly. "That's what your children have," he said. "That same mechanism, or the absence of it." He finished his whiskey. "Your daughter went through 23 years of my records and found 41 discrepancies in 5 days. My accountant missed all of them for 6 years. Maisie sees numbers differently," Gideon said. "She sees things differently," Abel said. "Like her father." He left before dark, and Gideon sat alone on the porch for a while after, in the autumn one evening, and the particular quiet of a ranch at end of day when the animals are settled and the work is done. The pastures were in better shape than they'd been since Lenora's father was alive. According to Fletcher, who had reasons to compare, the cattle count was up. The 3-year Stonehaven contract was performing ahead of its projections. 3 other regional ranching families had used Lenora's logging route to establish their own independent relationships with Stonehaven buyers, which had the practical effect of making the route less of a secret advantage and more of a regional resource, which was something Lenora had encouraged deliberately, because she understood better than most people, gave her credit for understanding that her long-term security lay in a healthy regional economy around her, not in maintaining advantages over her neighbors. She'd said that to Harold on his second visit in August. Harold had come back, as she'd predicted, but with the revised narrative, she'd also predicted the case outcome had converted his concern about her judgment into cautious acknowledgement that her judgment had been, on reflection, sound. Harold's version of an apology was a lengthy recitation of why he now agreed with decisions he'd previously questioned, which was recognizably Harold, but was also, Gideon thought, the best version of Harold available, and probably worth accepting in that spirit. Warren had shaken Gideon's hand on that visit with genuine warmth. "You were right to stay," Warren said quietly, while Harold was talking to Lenora in the office. "I saw that in January. I should have said it sooner." "You said it now," Gideon said. September moved into the particular golden quality that Montana autumns had, the light going sideways and warm, the aspens turning, the mornings cold enough to remind you what was coming, but the afternoons still carrying real warmth. It was the most beautiful time of year in that country. And Gideon had lived in that country long enough to know it and feel it. And sitting on that porch in that light, he was aware of something that he'd been circling for months without quite landing on. He'd been waiting for the feeling of being ready, waiting for some internal signal that the right time had arrived, that circumstances had aligned in a way that made the next step obviously correct. He'd been waiting, he realized, the way a man waited when the thing he was waiting for was himself when the obstacle wasn't situation, but his own unwillingness to claim what was already true. He went inside. Lenora was in the kitchen. Maisie had gone to bed an hour ago, tired from a day that had included reorganizing the Stonehaven contract documentation into a new system she'd designed and explaining that system to Lenora in detail. Caleb was in the barn. He often stayed late with the horses now, not irresponsibly, but with Gideon's explicit knowledge. Because the barn in the evening was clearly where Caleb thought best, and the horses didn't seem to mind the company. Lenora was at the table with the ranch accounts. She looked up when he came in. He sat down across from her, not at an angle but directly across, the way he sat when he intended to say something that required being looked at squarely. She put down her pen. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said, no wariness in it, just open. "I've been telling myself for months that I wasn't going to make your situation more complicated than it already was. That you had enough to manage the case, the cousins, the contract, the reputation, without me adding something personal to it that you hadn't asked for and might not want." He kept his eyes on hers. And that was mostly true. But it was also easier than saying the actual thing. So I kept finding reasons to wait. She was very still. The particular stillness that meant she was listening completely. "I love you," he said. It came out without the preparation he'd spent 3 months pretending not to make. "Not because of this ranch or what you've built here or what you did for my children. Because of who you are when things are hard, which is who you actually are, and that person is." He stopped. "I'm not good at this part." "You're doing fine," she said quietly. "I don't want anything from Ironwood Crown," he said. "I want that to be clear. I'm not telling you this because the crisis is over and I'm positioning for something. I'm telling you because it's true and I've been a coward about it for too long." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp between them was doing what lamps did, making the world small and warm and specific, just the space inside the light. Just the two of them at this table that had held Maisie's ledgers and Pembroke's documents and Abel's testimony and all the practical work of the past year. "I know you don't want anything from this ranch," she said. "I've known that since the pump." "The pump," he said. "You fixed it before I knew your name," she said, "and didn't tell me you'd done it. That was when I knew." She paused. "What I've been waiting for is for you to stop acting like loving someone is a transaction that creates obligation. Like if you say it, you're putting a claim on something. I don't want to put a claim on, I know," she said. "That's the point. That's the thing that—" She stopped. And he saw something in her face that was not her usual controlled composure, but was the thing underneath it, the thing that composure was built on top of. 3 years I ran this ranch alone, after my father died, and people kept telling me I needed someone to help me manage it, someone to share the decisions, someone to make the hard calls with. And what they meant was they thought I needed a man to do those things. What I actually needed was someone who understood that I didn't need rescuing, that I was already capable, that what was worth wanting wasn't help, it was company. She looked at him directly. "You never once tried to rescue me. You didn't need it," he said. "No," she said. "I didn't. And you knew that from the beginning, and you acted accordingly, and that is—" She let out a breath. "That's rarer than it should be." He said nothing, because she wasn't finished. "I love you," she said. "I've known it since the mountain. Since the rope through the fork, and your sun coming clear, and you on your hands and knees in the snow looking at Caleb's face." She paused. "That's when I knew it completely. Though I think it had been building since before that." "The pump," he said again. The corner of her mouth moved. "Maybe the pump." They sat with it for a moment, the actual truth of it, finally said, and therefore real in a way it hadn't quite been before. Not comfortable in a soft way. Comfortable in the way of things that were solid, that had been tested by the weight put on them and had held. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held on. They married in October under the cottonwoods at the east end of the property that had gone the color of hammered gold. Not a large ceremony, there was no family to speak of for either of them, not the blood kind, and Gideon had learned by then that family was less about blood and more about who showed up when it was hard and stayed when it got harder. The people who came were the people who qualified by that measure, Fletcher and the Brant brothers. Addie the cook, who cried through the entire proceedings and denied it afterward, Abel Surser and his wife Ruth, who'd talked to Maisie for 3 hours at the April gathering and had been corresponding with her by letter since, the Whitfield family, several of the other ranching families from the case, Aldous Pryor, who'd ridden 3 days from Stonehaven because he said a contract signing wasn't the only thing worth making a ride for. Harold and Warren Ashford came. Harold shook Gideon's hand with the careful warmth of a man who was still revising his opinion in real time, but had decided the revision was probably correct. Warren hugged Lenora and said something in her ear that made her laugh, which Gideon counted as a success. Maisie stood beside Lenora the entire ceremony, with the contained joy of someone who had known this was coming and had been patient about it and was now allowing herself to feel the full fact of it. She was not a demonstrative child in public, that was a private quality, the joy, reserved for people she trusted completely. She held Lenora's hand during the words, and afterward she put her arms around Lenora's waist and didn't let go for a long time, and Lenora held her back with one arm. And Gideon stood beside them and felt the specific weight of the moment not heavy. The other kind of weight, the kind that meant something real, was standing there. Caleb shook his father's hand afterward, because Caleb expressed things through actions rather than words and a handshake. Between them meant what it meant: acknowledgement, respect, the transfer of something between men that didn't have a better form than that specific gesture. Then he shook Lenora's hand too, and she held his hand in both of hers for a moment and looked at him, and whatever passed between them in that look was between them. The reception was on the porch and in the yard, lasting into the evening, the fire going, the autumn air cold enough for coats, but not cold enough to drive anyone inside. People talked and ate, and the children from the ranching families ran around the yard in the gathering dark, with the particular energy of children at adult events who have been patient for the formal part and are now making up for it. At some point in the evening, Gideon walked down the lane to the gate, not for any specific reason, just to walk there, just to stand at the place where it had started. The gate stood open behind him, the way it had stood open since the spring, when Lenora had had it propped back and left it. She'd said it was for practical reasons, easier access during the busy season. He hadn't argued with the practical reason, but he'd noticed it. He turned and looked back at the ranch from the gate. The house was lit from inside, warm light in every window, the sound of voices, and the sound of the fire carrying down the lane to where he stood. He could see Caleb's silhouette in the barn's doorway, leaning against the frame the way he always leaned when he was watching the horses settle for the night. He could see Maisie's small figure at the porch railing, talking to Ruth Mercer, with the animated gestures she used when she was explaining something she found genuinely important, that Simpson says. He could see Lenora moving through the lit kitchen, and then she stopped and looked out the window. And even at this distance, he could see the specific way she found him at the gate. He thought about a morning in November, a snowstorm, $4.20, 2 children and nowhere left to go. He thought about knocking. There was a version of his life where he hadn't knocked, where he'd turned the wagons around and driven south into the storm because asking a stranger for help felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. He knew men who would have made that choice. He'd almost made it himself. The gap between almost and actually was the length of Maisie's cough in the back of a cold wagon, and he wasn't certain, even now, whether that was courage or just desperation wearing the right disguise. But he had knocked, and the lamp had moved, and here was what came from it. 31 families with restitution payments, and the experience of having fought something together. Abel Mercer's grandson taking over a ranch that could afford to modernize. Fletcher running the Ironwood Crown hands with the competence that had been there all along, waiting for permission to operate. A 3-year contract that other independent ranchers were pointing to and saying, this is what it looks like when you don't need strake. A territorial court record that said clearly, in language designed to be specific, that the system one man had built on isolation and quiet theft had been real, documented, and dismantled. And this, the gate open, the house lit, his children inside it, his wife looking out the window, finding him in the dark, the October air cold and clean, and carrying the smell of the cottonwoods going gold. He had not planned any of this. Not one part of it had gone the way a plan would have organized it. He'd made one honest statement in a cattle way, and it had cost him everything he had, and then he'd knocked on a gate in a snowstorm because his daughter was coughing, and he was out of road, and the consequences of those two impulsive, unplanned, slightly desperate decisions had accumulated into this specific evening with this specific view. He thought about what it meant. Not the story version of what it meant, the clean version where honesty is rewarded and courage produces good outcomes. He didn't quite believe that version because he'd known honest men whose honesty went unrewarded, and he'd known courageous people whose courage produced only loss. The world wasn't built on clean cause and effect. He knew that. What he believed was something smaller and more durable than that. That the choice to tell the truth when you saw something wrong, to knock on the gate when your child needed warmth, to fix the pump because leaving it broken was a form of dishonesty. Those choices didn't guarantee outcomes. They just determined what kind of person you were in the making of them. And the kind of person you were in those moments was the only kind of person you actually got to be. Strake had been a man who looked at the world and saw what he could extract from it. He'd extracted considerably for a long time, and now he was gone, and 31 families were rebuilding, and the records were in a court archive that would outlast everyone who'd been in that room. Gideon had been a windows were dark, had been a man who looked at the world and couldn't stop seeing what was wrong in it and couldn't make himself walk past it without saying something. That quality had cost him, repeatedly, genuinely, in ways that weren't romantic or noble in the moment, but were just expensive and painful. And it had also led him here, to this gate, with this view, on this evening. He didn't think that proved anything general about the world. He thought it proved something specific about what happened when the right people found each other, when the person who couldn't stop seeing what was wrong met the person who'd been fighting alone for too long, and they both decided, without quite planning it, to stop being alone. Lenora had come down the lane while he was thinking. He hadn't heard her, which said something about his state of mind and something about how quietly she moved when she chose to. She stood beside him at the gate and looked back at the house the same way he'd been looking at it. "Caleb's going to sleep in the barn tonight," she said. "He thinks I don't know, but he told Maisie, who told me. He does that sometimes," Gideon said. "I know," she said. "I've stopped worrying about it." That took a while. "It took until I understood that he's not running away from the house," she said. That's where he thinks. The horses help him think." She paused. "Like you help me think." He looked at her. "You're not the horses," she said. "I'm not comparing you to horses. I understood that. I'm saying that some people help you think," she said. "Not by telling you what to think. Just by being there in a way that makes the thinking clearer." He put his arms around her shoulders and she leaned into it, not dramatically but completely, the way she did the things she did fully, without reservation, once she'd decided. The house glowed in the distance. The cottonwoods stood gold around it, losing their leaves in the dark in the slow, patient way of things that let go when it was time and knew they'd come back. Maisie's laugh carried down the lane from the porch, the full one, the real one, the one he'd been waiting to hear more of since November of the year before. Gideon had ridden through that gate, believing he needed one night. He understood now that what he'd needed, and what he'd found, was harder to name than shelter and more durable than safety. It was the thing that happened when you stopped running the calculus of whether you deserved something, and just let it be real. It was the thing his son had named, standing in a pasture in the November dark, "It's okay to let it be good." The gate stood open behind them both. The lane ran straight to the house. They walked back toward the light.